Every civilization that has ever risen believed it would last forever. The Sumerians believed it. The Egyptians believed it. The Romans certainly believed it. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, walking through the ruins of their confidence. 6 great civilizations rose, dominated their known world, and then collapsed into dust and myth. And if the pattern holds, if history really does move in cycles the way some researchers suspect, then we might be living inside the 7th. Think about that for a second, not the first. Not some unprecedented peak of human achievement standing alone in history. The 7th. Just another link in a chain that stretches back over 5,000 years, one that every single time has ended the same way. Rise, dominance, collapse, silence. But here's what's strange. When you actually look at how long each of these civilizations lasted, the numbers don't match what most of us assume. Some collapsed far faster than you'd think. Others held on for centuries longer than history class ever gave them credit for. And when you line up all 6 lifespans side by side, something starts to emerge. A pattern, a rhythm, maybe even a warning. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So subscribe maybe and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now for you. I checked the comments and it's wild. Tokyo at midnight, Toronto at sunset, someone in Berlin having their morning coffee, all listening to the same story about civilizations that ended long before any of our countries existed. There's something oddly comforting about that. All of us scattered across time zones, connected by the same curiosity about how it all falls apart. And if you want to support the show, the easiest way is to follow it on Spotify and listen there. Links in the description. Now, before we get to us, the possible 7th, we need to understand the 6 that came before. Where they rose, how long they actually lasted, and most importantly, why they didn't last forever. Let's start where civilization itself starts. Southern Mesopotamia, somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, roughly 4,500 BCE. Hot, flat, unforgiving land. No mountains for stone, no forests for timber, barely any rainfall to speak of. On paper, it's one of the worst places on earth to build something that lasts. And yet, this is exactly where humans built the first true civilization. Not a village, not a chiefdom. A civilization complete with cities, laws, writing, and gods, who apparently expected a lot of paperwork. We call these people the Sumerians, though it's worth pointing out they probably never called themselves that. The word comes from their neighbours, the Akkadians, who used it to describe the region. The Sumerians themselves used a term that roughly translates to something like the black-headed people. Small detail, but it's a good reminder that a lot of what we know about ancient civilizations comes filtered through someone else's language, someone else's records, someone else's interpretation. History is rarely a first-person account. What we do know is that sometime around 4000 BCE, small farming settlements along the Euphrates began growing into something bigger. And one of those settlements, a place called Uruk, exploded in size in a way that genuinely stunned archaeologists when they first uncovered it. By around 3200 BCE, Uruk may have housed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's larger than most European cities would be for the next 4,000 years. This wasn't a town. This was, by any reasonable definition, the first city on planet Earth. And once you have a city that size, you suddenly have a problem nobody had ever really faced before. How do you keep track of everyone? How do you know who owes grain to whom? Who owns which plot of land? Whose sheep actually belong to the temple versus the farmer down the road? Memory works fine for a village of 50 people. It falls apart completely at 40,000. So the Sumerians did something that would end up being one of the most consequential inventions in human history. They invented writing, not poetry first, not sacred texts. Receipts. The earliest known writing, cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, wasn't recording myths or kings. It was recording transactions, barley deliveries, beer rations, livestock counts. Some historians find this almost funny, that the birth of literacy, the thing that would eventually give us law codes and epic poems and philosophy, started as an accounting trick to keep temple inventories straight. But maybe that's exactly how it should have started. Civilization needed bureaucracy before it needed beauty. Over the following centuries, cuneiform evolved from simple pictographs into a genuinely sophisticated writing system capable of recording language itself. Not just symbols for objects, but grammar, syntax, abstract ideas. And once you can write down an idea, you can preserve it, share it, argue about it, pass it down to someone who never even met you. That's not a small thing. That might be one of the biggest turning points in the entire human story, arguably as significant as anything that happened during those earlier hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure that shaped our species in the first place. Uruk wasn't alone for long. Other city-states rose up along the rivers, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, Kish, each with its own ruler, its own patron god, its own walls and irrigation canals. And here's something that tends to surprise people. Sumer was never one unified nation the way we might picture ancient Egypt. There was no single Sumerian king ruling from one capital for 1,000 years. Instead, it was a patchwork of independent city-states, sometimes trading with each other, sometimes allying against a common threat, and quite often going to war over water rights, borderland, or simple political ambition. Some historians compare it to ancient Greece more than to Egypt, dozens of proud, fiercely independent cities sharing a language and a culture, but never quite sharing a throne. So what actually held this fragmented world together? What made it a civilization rather than just a scattered collection of rival towns? The answer seems to be religion, and specifically the temple. Each Sumerian city was built around a massive step structure called a ziggurat, a kind of artificial mountain reaching toward the heavens, dedicated to that city's patron deity. The temple wasn't just a place of worship. It was the economic engine of the entire city. Temples owned vast tracts of farmland. Temples employed farmers, brewers, weavers, scribes. Temples stored the grain surplus and redistributed it during lean years. In a very real sense, the god of the city was also its landlord, its employer, and its insurance policy all rolled into one. Political power in Sumer grew directly out of this religious structure. Early rulers, often called En or later Lugal, meaning something close to big man, derived their authority from their role as high priest or chief servant of the city's god. Kingship wasn't separate from religion, it was an extension of it. A Sumerian king didn't just rule because he had the biggest army, though that certainly helped. He ruled because he was, at least in the eyes of his people, the one chosen to manage the god's city on the god's behalf. This blending of political and religious authority would go on to become a template that echoes through nearly every ancient civilization that followed, including quite a few we'll be talking about later in this list. It's a strange thing to sit with, a civilization built on rivers that constantly shifted course, in a region with almost no natural defences, no stone, barely any rain, and yet it produced writing, cities of tens of thousands, towering temples, and a political religious system stable enough to last for centuries. Stable, but as we're about to see, not invincible. For a while it probably felt invincible from the inside. You're born in a city with walls thick enough to stop an army, canals that turn desert into wheat, temples piled high with grain and beer. The gods are clearly on your side. Your scribes can literally write reality into clay. How could this possibly end? The answer is, very slowly, and from a lot of different directions at once. First, there were the neighbours. Sumer's success didn't happen in a vacuum. To the north and west, Semitic-speaking peoples were watching, trading, learning. They saw the cities, the writing, the wealth, moving along those rivers and thought, we'll have some of that. Over centuries, what started as small migrations and mercenary work began turning into something more serious. Around 2330 BCE, a man named Sargon of Akkad, who according to later legends started life as a nobody, a cupbearer, pulled off one of history's great political speedruns. He united several northern Mesopotamian cities under his rule, then turned south and systematically broke Sumer's independence. One by one, the old city-states, Kish, Uruk, Lagash, fell under Akkadian control. From the Sumerian point of view, this was probably terrifying and humiliating, but from our point of view, it's more complicated. Sargon didn't march in and burn everything. He reused it. He kept the bureaucrats. He kept the scribes. He used cuneiform. He kept the gods, just rearranged who was on top. It's like a hostile corporate takeover. New logo on the building. Same middle managers inside. This is where the story of how long Sumer lasted gets fuzzy. Culturally, Sumer didn't just vanish under Akkadian rule. Sumerian continued to be used as a language of scholarship and religion, even as Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the everyday speech of the empire. But politically, the old patchwork of independent Sumerian city-states was gone. The first true civilization had just been swallowed by the first true empire, and yet the empire that broke Sumer's independence didn't last very long either. About a century and a half after Sargon, the Akkadian Empire started to crack. Internal rebellions, dynastic struggles, pressure from mountain tribes to the east and steppe nomads to the north. By around 2150 BCE, the so-called Gutians, people from the Zagros Mountains, were pouring into the region. Later, Sumerian writers absolutely hated them. They blamed them for ruining everything. The canals, the crops, the temples. How much of that is propaganda and how much is accurate is still debated. But the archaeological signal is clear enough. Urban life in southern Mesopotamia took a major hit. Some cities shrank. Some were abandoned. Monumental buildings slowed or stopped. Inscriptions become rarer. The whole urban system that had made Sumer possible was wobbling. If this were a movie, this might be where the credits roll, and thus ended the first civilization. But history is messier than that. Sumer did something civilizations sometimes manage to do when they get knocked down. It tried to reboot around 2100 BCE. The city of staged a comeback. A dynasty we now call the Third Dynasty of managed to push out the Gutians, reunify much of southern Mesopotamia, and briefly recreate something that looked a lot like a Sumerian Golden Age. Massive ziggurats were built or rebuilt at Uruk, Nippur. Scribes were cranking out bureaucratic tablets by the tens of thousands. Labour rosters, tax accounts, ration lists. It was hyper-organised, top-down, almost eerily modern in its obsession with record-keeping. But if you zoom in on the clay tablets from this period, you notice something telling. The administration loves to write in Sumerian. Legal documents, royal inscriptions, religious texts, Sumerian everywhere. Everyday reality, though, is shifting. Personal names, loan contracts, little scribbles in the margins. They're often in Akkadian. It's as if Latin is still the serious language on official paper, but everybody in the marketplace is speaking something else. So even in Sumer's political revival, its language and culture were already being slowly diluted, folded into a larger Mesopotamian blend. The civilization that had once been the cutting edge was becoming the classical text. Revered, imitated, but no longer where the new ideas were emerging. and then the environment started turning against them. Southern Mesopotamia's whole trick was irrigation. Take unpredictable river flow, spread it over fields, guarantee crops. But irrigation in a flat, hot landscape comes with a long-term bill. When you pull river water onto your fields, you're also pulling dissolved salts. In a wet climate, rain washes those salts away. In a dry one, the water evaporates and the salts stay behind, gradually poisoning the soil. Over centuries, that silent process started to bite. Archaeobotanists and soil studies suggest that in many southern fields, barley, a salt-tolerant crop, replaced wheat because wheat yields were collapsing. Then even barley yields dropped. Written records from the Ur-3 period and later talk about falling rations, food shortages, desperate land sales. The land that had once been turned into an artificial Eden was slowly turning back into something closer to the desert it had started as, on top of salinization, the rivers themselves refused to sit still. The Tigris and Euphrates wander over geological timescales, but in a low, flat plain, even relatively small shifts in channel can be catastrophic. A city that invested centuries of labour into one canal system could wake up, metaphorically, to find the main river channel had started favouring a different path. Too far away, too shallow, too unpredictable. Suddenly your lifeline is trickling somewhere else. When that happens once, you dig new canals. When it happens over and over across generations, while your soil is getting saltier and your political system is under pressure, it becomes something else, a slow-motion reason to leave. To move north where rainfall was a bit more forgiving. To climb up into areas where the rivers hadn't exhausted the land yet. And while the earth and water were undermining Sumer from below, human enemies were still knocking at the gates from above. To the northeast, Elamites in what is now southwestern Iran watched Ur's wealth with interest. Around 2004 BCE they sacked Ur, hauled off the last king of the Ur III dynasty, and effectively decapitated the last fully Sumerian state. Again, this wasn't a clean lights-out moment. People didn't walk out of their houses one day and forget they were Sumerian. But step by step, invasion by invasion, flood by flood, salt crystal by salt crystal, the centre of gravity in Mesopotamia was shifting away from the old southern cities. New powers would rise further north, places like Isin, Larsa, and especially Babylon, building on Sumerian foundations but speaking different languages, worshipping slightly different versions of the gods, writing law codes with new names at the top. By the time those new kingdoms took centre stage, Sumer was already sliding from current reality into ancient heritage. Yet in a way, that wasn't the end of its story at all. Its greatest influence was still to come, not as a living empire, but as something else entirely. Because that something else is where we run into the core problem of this whole video. When does a civilization actually end? With Sumer, that question is more than just academic nitpicking. It literally changes the answer to how long did the first civilization last? By centuries. If you draw the line at political independence, you could argue Sumer ends with Sargon of Akkad around 2330 BCE. After that point, the old city-states are no longer calling their own shots. They're provinces in somebody else's empire. If you're a Sumerian aristocrat whose family has ruled Lagash for generations, the day an Akkadian governor takes your palace probably feels like the end of the world. But look at the tablets, and it's not that simple. After Sargon, Sumerian scribes keep writing, Sumerian gods keep getting offerings, Sumerian hymns are still being copied and recopied. The shapes on the clay don't suddenly flip from Sumerian to Akkadian like a light switch. It's more like two languages and two traditions running in parallel, influencing each other, slowly merging. So maybe you say, fine, don't use politics, use language. A civilization is over when its language stops being anyone's mother tongue. By that standard, Sumer might have lasted significantly longer. There's evidence that Sumerian was still spoken natively in some pockets of southern Mesopotamia even after the fall of Ur around 2000 BCE. It just gradually got squeezed out neighbourhood by neighbourhood, generation by generation, by Akkadian dialects. Like Latin in late Roman Gaul, there's no single day when the last Sumerian wakes up, clears their throat and says, "Right, that's it. Switching to Akkadian now," it fades. And yet even when it faded as a spoken language, it refused to die where it mattered most for longevity, in the schools. For more than 1,000 years after Sumerian stopped being anyone's everyday speech, it survived as what you might call the dead but never buried language of Mesopotamia. If you were a serious scribe in Babylon or Assyria, you learned Sumerian the way medieval monks learned Latin. You memorized Sumerian word lists paired with Akkadian translations. You copied Sumerian myths, Sumerian proverbs, Sumerian legal formulas. You cursed the old grammar in the margins. To the people doing that, Sumer wasn't some extinct foreign culture. It was the deep past of their own world. Kings in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE liked to present themselves as restorers of ancient Sumerian temples, rebuilders of Sumerian cities. They dug up old inscriptions and recarved them. They listed Sumerian rulers in king lists that stretched their own dynasties back into myth. So here's the dilemma. If the later Mesopotamians themselves thought they were walking in Sumer's footsteps, should we be chopping the story up into neat boxes labelled Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian? Or should we see it as one very long civilizational project with different phases and accents? Historians don't fully agree, and that's why you'll see wildly different numbers for how long Sumerian civilization lasted. Some like a tight definition. Sumer runs from the first clear urban layers in the south, around 3500–3200 BCE, to the fall of Ur III, around 2000 BCE. That's roughly 1,500 years of cities run by rulers who write and think primarily in Sumerian, worship a Sumerian-framed pantheon, and sit at the centre of power. After that, it's someone else's show. Others expand the window. If you include the earlier village cultures feeding into Sumer, or if you let the Sumerian legacy period stretch into the old Babylonian age, when scribes in Babylon are still copying Sumerian myths like the flood story, that will eventually echo in the Hebrew Bible, you can edge closer to 2,000 years, or even a bit more. The surface institutions change, but the underlying scripts, gods, and ideas are clearly flowing from the same source. There's another way to slice it again. Instead of asking, when did Sumer die? Ask, when did nobody care about Sumer anymore? On that scale, Sumer is a zombie. It refuses to stay in the grave. Clay tablets with Sumerian texts are still being copied around 500 BCE, 2,000 years after the last native speaker likely passed away. Scholars in the Neo-Babylonian and Persian periods are still sorting Sumerian signs, still producing grammatical lists, still keeping the language on life support, because so many of their sacred texts, omens, incantations, and rituals are written in it. It's like if modern physicists had to learn ancient Egyptian to read the original laws of motion. And then finally there's the longest possible timeline. Not the language, not the dynasties, but the ideas. Cuneiform starts in Sumer. The basic legal concepts, contracts, debt, interest, written law, get their first durable form in Sumerian cities. The idea that a ruler publishes a law code so that the strong may not oppress the weak shows up in Sumer centuries before Hammurabi makes it famous. The very architecture of the sacred platform, the ziggurat, feeds into later ideas about temples and mountains of the gods. Those lines run forward into Babylonian astronomy, into Assyrian Empire craft, into Persian administration, into Greek and Roman understandings of what the East is, and from there into the religious and legal traditions that shape a lot of the modern world. You can overstate those connections, but it's hard to deny that a piece of Sumer's mental world is still quietly embedded in our own. So when we say Sumer thrived for roughly 2,000 years, what we really mean is this. For maybe 15 to 20 centuries, there was a living, evolving society in southern Mesopotamia that we can recognize as distinctly Sumerian, its own language, its own pantheon, its own kings and cities. After that, the political structure collapsed, the language faded from the streets, and power flowed north. But the patterns Sumer invented, writing, bureaucracy, temple states, written law, scholarly tradition, never really stopped. They just changed owners. Did Sumer end with Sargon? With the fall of Ur? With the last scribe who could still actually speak what he was painstakingly copying? Or has it, in a distorted, distant way, never quite ended because we're still living in a world it helped design? Hold that ambiguity in your mind, because we're going to see it again and again. Civilizations almost never die like individuals do. They dissolve, merge, get repackaged, rebranded. Their ruins become someone else's foundation stones. And if Sumer is the prototype, the first experiment in large-scale urban civilization, our next stop is the civilization that took that experiment, ran with it for even longer, and left behind monuments so massive that for most of history people assumed gods or giants must have built them. To measure how long a civilization can ride the Nile, we head west into the desert and meet the pharaohs. 2. Ancient Egyptian civilization. If Sumer is the prototype running on early access code, Egypt is the long-term release build. When people say ancient civilization, most of us don't picture mud brick platforms on a flat plain. We picture a river cutting through a desert, stone pyramids on the horizon, a ruler with a cobra on his forehead, claiming he's literally a god in human form. What's wild is that, underneath the aesthetic upgrade, Egypt is wrestling with the same basic questions Sumer did. How do you turn scattered villages into a single, self-aware civilization that can last longer than any of the people who build it? In Egypt, the answer begins with a river and a merger. For thousands of years before the pharaohs we learn in school, the Nile Valley is just a really good place for small human societies. The river floods predictably, dumping fresh silt on the banks. Narrow strips of black soil hug a ribbon of water, surrounded on both sides by a whole lot of nothing. To the west, desert; to the east, more desert. Above and below, cataracts, marshes, seas. That geography does something crucial. It puts humans in a long, thin corridor with hard walls. Different communities can't just fan out in every direction like they could in Mesopotamia. They're stacked along the same lifeline, mile after mile, watching the same water rise and fall. Over time, those communities crystallize into two distinct regions the Egyptians themselves will later call the Two Lands. Upstream, in the narrow, cliff-walled stretch of the Nile, you get what we now call Upper Egypt. Downstream, where the river splits into a fan of marshy channels near the Mediterranean, is Lower Egypt, the Delta. They have different ecologies, different resources, even slightly different styles of pottery and burial. Two cultures, one river. By around 3200–3100 BCE, both of these regions have their own proto-kingdoms. They're building bigger tombs, using more elaborate grave goods, maybe even experimenting with early hieroglyphic symbols on ceremonial objects. You can almost feel the arms race starting. And then, somewhere around 3100 BCE, the rivalry ends in the most world-changing merger-acquisition in African history. We don't know the blow-by-blow. What we have are fragmentary remains, carved palettes, later king lists, legends written centuries after the fact. These say that a ruler from the south, often called Narmer, sometimes Menes, unites Upper and Lower Egypt, conquering or absorbing the delta and stitching the entire Nile Valley into a single political unit. On the famous Narmer palette, this unification gets mythologized. One side shows a king in the tall white crown of Upper Egypt, smiting an enemy. Flip it, and he's wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, presiding over a scene of orderly decapitated foes. The message is not subtle. I, the king, embody both lands, and anyone who disagrees gets turned into an art motif. Whether Narmer did it in one dramatic campaign, or we're compressing generations of conflict and alliance into one legendary name, the result is the same. For the first time in history, pretty much the entire course of the Nile in Egypt is under a single ruler. That act of unification is the birth of pharaonic rule, and it matters for more than just borders. Because to keep this ridiculously long, narrow kingdom from snapping back into pieces, the early rulers do something very clever. They don't just conquer, they invent an identity so powerful that it can weld geography, politics, and religion into one. The king isn't just a warlord with more soldiers, he becomes the Nesu Biti, the dual king, he of the sedge and the bee, the living embodiment of the two lands. He wears a double crown that literally fuses the white and red crowns together. He takes on a Horus name linking him to the falcon god. Later, pharaohs will be described as sons of Ra, incarnations of Horus, and then Osiris after death. Ruler, state, gods and country are all braided into the same rope. In Mesopotamia, kings are powerful humans negotiating with capricious gods. In Egypt, the line blurs. The pharaoh is a point of contact where cosmic order, what the Egyptians call ma'at, enters the human realm. If he does his job, the Nile floods properly, the sun rises, the stars keep their course. If he fails, the universe frays. That fusion of cosmic and political order is the engine behind Egypt's first great golden age, the Old Kingdom. Roughly from 2700 to 2200 BCE, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom ride the momentum of unification and relatively stable climate into one of the most intense construction projects in human history. This is when Egypt as a civilization writes itself into stone, so hard that we're still reading it 4,500 years later. The early dynasties refine hieroglyphic writing, formalize bureaucracy, and centralize the tax system. Grain, labour, and goods from up and down the Nile are funneled into royal projects. In return, the king performs rituals, maintains mat, and redistributes resources in ways that keep elites loyal and villagers fed, most of the time. The most visible result of that centralization is the pyramids. These aren't just oversized graves, they're three-dimensional theology. A pyramid is a giant machine designed to turn a dead king into an immortal star-bound being, and in doing so prove that the cosmic order is still intact. Their precise alignments, internal passages, and associated temples are all about connecting the pharaoh's body to the sky, the underworld, and the daily cycle of the sun. To pull that off, you need not only labour and stone, but also administrators who can count rations, schedule work crews, and record offerings across hundreds of miles. You need local officials who accept that their power comes from the centre, and priests who buy into the idea that the king's fate is tied to the health of the whole country. For several centuries it works. The Old Kingdom becomes a kind of state-sponsored eternity project. But nothing that ambitious runs on autopilot forever. Over time, regional governors, the nomarchs, accumulate land, wealth, and local loyalties. The Old Kingdom state has to juggle rising elite power, fluctuating Nile floods, and its own enormous ritual obligations. Eventually that balance cracks, and Egypt slides into a period of political fragmentation historians call the First Intermediate Period. What matters for our story isn't the chaos itself, but what happens next. Because, unlike many early state experiments that collapse and vanish from the record, Egypt pulls off something extraordinary. It reboots. When a new line of rulers from Thebes reunifies the land around 2050 BCE, they don't start with a blank slate. They inherit centuries of religious concepts, administrative practices, and a very clear memory that once upon a time the Nile was united under a single king who kept Mat. This reboot era is what we call the Middle Kingdom, where the Old Kingdom's vibe is divine king builds mountains for himself. The Middle Kingdom feels more managerial and introspective. The royal tombs shrink a bit in spectacle, but the state invests heavily in irrigation, fortifications, and regional temples. Literature flourishes, stories, wisdom texts, and pessimistic dialogues that hint Egyptians are thinking hard about justice, suffering, and what makes a good ruler. The idea of Mat broadens. It's not just something the pharaoh guarantees by existing, it becomes a standard against which even kings can be judged. Tomb autobiographies start advertising how local officials fed the hungry during famines, protected the weak, acted as good servants of the king and of Mat itself. Once again, though, long-term stability proves hard to maintain. External pressure from Asiatic groups in the delta and internal strains eventually crack the system a second time. Egypt fragments, foreign dynasties seize parts of the Nile, and for a while, the old ideal of a united two lands looks like it might be a thing of the past. And then, remarkably, Egypt pulls off the trick again. A southern dynasty from Thebes campaigns north, drives out the Hyksos rulers and reunites the country for a third great act, the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 170 BCE. If the Old Kingdom is pyramids, and the Middle Kingdom is introspection, the New Kingdom is Egypt turned outward and turned up to 11. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, Akhenaten and Ramesses II preside over an Egypt that's no longer just guarding its river. It's projecting power deep into the Levant and Nubia, running diplomatic networks with other great powers, and constructing vast temple complexes like Karnak and Luxor. The king is still divine, but the job description now includes imperial warlord and international player. The Old Kingdom had to invent the pharaoh. The New Kingdom has to manage what it means to be a god-king in a crowded world full of other states, other gods, and new ideas. And that tension between an ancient river-bound identity and a sprawling international role is where the story of Egypt's longevity really starts to get interesting. Because even after 3 golden ages, multiple collapses and foreign invasions, Egypt doesn't simply flick off like a light. It bends, adapts, reinvents what it means to be the two lands again and again. To see how it managed that trick when so many other civilizations broke and never came back, we need to follow the Nile a little further downstream in time. So why does this place, this long green ribbon in the sand, keep coming back from the dead when so many other early civilizations just don't? Historians argue about details, but a few big patterns show up over and over. First, the obvious one, the Nile itself. Egypt doesn't farm the way Mesopotamia does. In Mesopotamia, you're constantly fighting the rivers. They flood unpredictably. They salt your fields, they shift course. You build bigger levees, dig more canals, push the land harder, and over centuries you quietly wreck your own soil. When politics stumbles, the environment doesn't give you much slack. The Nile is different. For most of Egyptian history, its floods are remarkably regular. The river rises in summer, spreads silt over a narrow band of land, then retreats. You don't have to irrigate a vast open plain. You just manage a tight strip of mud along a single channel. That regularity doesn't mean easy. A few bad years in a row can still trigger famine. But it does mean the basic productivity of the land doesn't collapse every time the central government does. Local communities know how to plant, when to harvest, how to work with the flood. You can lose a dynasty and still grow barley. That's crucial, because when the big state falls apart, the underlying economic engine doesn't. The river keeps showing up. Villages keep storing grain. Temples keep collecting offerings. The skeleton of civilization stays standing even when the head is missing. Geography doubles down on this advantage. Egypt is basically a fortress with a freeway running down the middle. That narrow valley with desert walls doesn't just unify people in good times, it cushions them in bad ones. There's only so much room for invaders to maneuver. Nomadic groups from the desert have trouble sustaining large armies along the banks. Most foreign threats have to squeeze in through the delta or push up from Nubia, and when they do, they're stuck using the same linear route everyone else does. This means collapse in Egypt often looks different than collapse somewhere like Mesopotamia. In Iraq, you can have one city-state rise as another falls, or whole regions get knocked out by shifting rivers and migrating peoples. In Egypt, it's much harder to wipe out the entire chain at once. You can lose the north while the south regroups. You can have Thebes rise when Memphis falters, or vice versa. That built-in redundancy, multiple major centers along one lifeline, makes total civilizational wipeout less likely. Pieces can hold while other pieces burn, but geography and rivers only get you so far. The really weird, powerful thing about Egypt is the software running on top of that hardware, its culture. From very early on, the Egyptians create a story about themselves that is both incredibly rigid and surprisingly flexible. On one hand, the ideal is always the same: a single king ruling the two lands in accordance with Marat. That phrase, two lands, gets repeated like a spell for thousands of years. Kings in every period, even foreign ones, plaster it on monuments, Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt. They're not just bragging about territory. They're plugging themselves into a very old narrative about how the world is supposed to be arranged. On the other hand, who gets to play pharaoh in that story can change. Native dynasties, Libyan warlords, Nubian kings, Assyrian generals, Persian emperors, even, eventually, Macedonian Greeks. Again and again, outsiders step into the Egyptian script instead of deleting it. They adopt the titles, commission the temples, perform the rituals. In some cases, they even get mummified in Egyptian style. Why would conquerors go along with that? Because by the time foreign powers arrive, the ideological machinery of Egypt is tempting. If you can pose as the guarantor of Ma'at, if you can present yourself as the next link in a chain going back to Nama and beyond, you don't just occupy a country, you inherit a ready-made justification for ruling it. So the story persists even when the cast changes. That continuity of institutions and symbols is a huge part of why Egypt's civilization clock keeps running. Temples might be the best example of this. Egyptian temples aren't just churches. They're economic engines, archives, employment centers, and logistic hubs. They own land, manage labor, store grain, and participate in long-distance trade. They keep scribes busy copying texts, priests cycling through rituals, craftsmen carving reliefs. When a dynasty falls, temples don't usually vanish. New rulers can cut their funding, favour different gods, or build rival sanctuaries, but the basic temple economy keeps humming. Local elites maintain endowments, villagers keep bringing offerings. Priests keep chanting the same hymns they learned from older papyri. That turns temples into memory banks. Administrative techniques, myth cycles, calendrical knowledge, architectural know-how, the stuff that makes Egypt Egypt is being recopied and reenacted daily, even while politics is a mess. So when a strong ruler finally reunites the two lands, they aren't starting from zero. They can tap into an existing class of literate officials, an existing network of temple estates, and an existing ideological framework that says, yes, of course, this is how the world is supposed to work. We've just been waiting for you to fix it. There's another piece: writing. Egypt isn't the only place with early writing, but it treats writing with a particular kind of reverence. Hieroglyphs are literally called the gods' words. To write something in that script isn't just to note it down, it's to anchor it in the cosmic order. Names, titles, spells, tax records, they all become part of an enduring, quasi-sacred record. That attitude encourages conservatism in form, but persistence in content. Scribes in the New Kingdom can still read and copy texts written 1,000 years earlier, often in deliberate archaisms that make them feel even older. They see themselves as custodians of an ancient corpus, not inventors starting fresh with each generation. From a civilizational perspective, that's gold. It means laws, stories, medical recipes, technical instructions, and royal precedents can survive dark centuries in the back rooms of temple libraries, waiting to be pulled out and reactivated. And then there's how Egyptians think about time itself. A lot of their religious imagery is cyclical. The sun god dies in the west, travels through the underworld, and rises again in the east. The Nile rises, falls, and rises. The king dies, becomes Osiris, and is reborn in his successor. Endings are framed as transformations, not annihilations. That mindset doesn't magically prevent famine or invasion. But it does shape how people interpret those events. A bad period becomes a breakdown of mat that must be repaired, not a sign that the whole experiment of Egyptian kingship was a mistake. Reunification isn't a brand new idea, it's the restoration of the proper order as it was in the first time. So each reconstruction can lean on this deep psychological script. We've been here before. The world fell out of balance. A righteous king restored it. The cycles of political history plug directly into the cycles of myth. Of course, none of this makes Egypt invincible. Its story includes real declines, brutal wars, and long stretches where local people are very aware that decisions are being made in foreign capitals. But when you stack the Nile's reliability, the valley's defensible shape, the temple's institutional memory, the flexibility of the pharaonic role, and a worldview that expects order to be lost and found again, you get a civilization that can absorb shocks, rebrand conquerors, and restart itself more often than most. And just when that whole system starts running into challenges it can't fully solve, from new kinds of warfare to globalized trade networks, Egypt faces a different kind of survival test. What happens when you're no longer the main character in your own land, but your symbols and stories still refuse to die? By the late 1st millennium BCE, that's basically Egypt's problem. The hardware is still there: the river, the valley, the temples, the scripts. The software is still running: Ma'at, the two lands, the king as cosmic linchpin. But the operating system is now sitting under layers and layers of other people's apps. First come the Assyrians with their siege engines and iron swords. They smash cities, drag off elites, and show Egyptians what it feels like to be on the receiving end of an empire that doesn't particularly care about your local gods. Then the Persians arrive. The Achaemenid kings are very good at ruling difference. They don't need everyone to be Persian. They need everyone to pay taxes and not rebel too often. So when they take Egypt in the 6th century BCE, they don't demolish the civilization. They slot it into a larger imperial puzzle. Persian kings put on pharaonic titles. They commission inscriptions in hieroglyphs. They make offerings to Egyptian deities. But the real decisions are being made in places like Susa and Persepolis. Egypt is now a wealthy province, a revenue stream, a strategic border, not the center of a world. From an Egyptian perspective, though, the story can still be told the old way. The foreigners are great kings who have, for the moment, picked up the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Maybe Matet can survive this. Then, in walks Alexander. When his Macedonian army defeats the Persians and marches into Egypt in 332 BCE, local elites don't just see a conqueror. They see an opportunity. Here's a man who needs legitimacy in a region he doesn't really understand. They know exactly what to offer. Alexander lets himself be hailed as pharaoh. He visits the oracle of Amun at Siwa and comes away declared the son of a god. New temples go up calling him beloved of this or that deity. The ancient script absorbs one more foreign name, writes it in a cartouche, and pretends the line is unbroken. After his death, one of his generals, Ptolemy, turns this into a system. The Ptolemies are Greek, speak Greek, marry their siblings in Greek fashion, and run their court out of a new coastal metropolis, Alexandria. It is about as un-Egyptian a capital as you can imagine, cosmopolitan, Mediterranean-facing, full of philosophers arguing in porticos. And yet a parallel Egypt keeps going. Out in the valley, temples still crown the horizon. Ptolemaic rulers fund gigantic building projects at Dendera, Edfu, Philae. The hieroglyphic inscriptions on those walls are some of the most elaborate ever carved, dense with theology, obsessed with the first time, packed with lists of every king who came before. Look closely and you can see what's happening. The temple texts are doubling down. In a world where power is shifting to Greek-speaking bureaucrats and Hellenistic cities, the priesthood is archiving every scrap of Egyptian identity it can think of, fossilizing it in stone. On paper, the Ptolemies are perfect pharaohs. They perform rituals, appear in reliefs smiting enemies, pose as sons of Amun or Horus. In practice, Egypt is now a hybrid zone. There are Greek polis with their own laws and assemblies. There are Egyptian villages operating on older custom. There are tax farmers, mercenary garrisons, ethnic enclaves. Contracts are written in Greek and Demotic side by side. Gods fuse, Amun with Zeus, Osiris with Dionysus, Isis with basically everyone. From the outside, it still looks like one civilization, Egypt under the Ptolemies. From the inside, identities are stacking and interleaving. And at the centre of that stack is a young queen whose name you already know. Cleopatra X grows up in this world of cross-cutting loyalties and overlapping scripts. She's a Ptolemy, so she's thoroughly Hellenistic. But unlike many of her ancestors, she actually learns Egyptian. She appears in Egyptian dress on temple walls, presents herself as Isis, made flesh, talks to priests and villagers in their own language. At the same time, she's writing to Roman generals in Greek, cutting deals in a Mediterranean system that no longer has room for fully independent pharaonic states. She is trying very consciously to do what Egypt has done for 2,000 years, absorb the foreign power into its own story and survive. Only this time the foreign power is Rome. Rome is different from the empires that came before. It is not built around a charismatic king slotting into local myths. It's a republic-turned autocracy, with a legalistic mindset and a taste for uniform control. It can adopt your gods, yes. It can let your temples hum. But its core identity is not negotiable in the way earlier conquerors' identities were. When Cleopatra aligns with Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, she's gambling that Egypt can once again attach itself to the next big thing and keep breathing. When she and Antony lose to Octavian at Actium, that gamble fails. In 30 BCE, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, annexes Egypt outright. No more quasi-independent dynasty, no more king of kings playing pharaoh to keep the priests happy. Egypt becomes the personal property of the Roman emperor, run by a prefect who answers directly to him. On the ground, life doesn't change overnight. The Nile still rises. Farmers still sow and reap. Temples still receive offerings. Festivals still wind along the river. Scribes still copy spells and hymns in scripts that are now already a bit old-fashioned. Roman emperors pick up some of the old tricks. They build at Egyptian temples. They appear in pharaonic poses on reliefs. They let the priesthood go on as a local elite, a useful interface between imperial administration and village life. But beneath that ritual continuity, something is quietly eroding. The real administrative language is Latin at the top, Greek in the middle. Hieroglyphs and demotic are increasingly confined to religious and local use. New legal norms seep in. Soldiers from across the empire settle in garrison towns. Roman-style cities, baths and cults appear along the Nile. For a couple of centuries, you get this uncanny double exposure. Egypt as an old civilization still performing itself, and Egypt as a Roman province being slotted into a different time scale, a different map. The long fade really begins when two forces converge, economic and religious change. Economically, Egypt is now a grain engine for someone else's capital. Its surpluses flow north to feed Rome and later Constantinople. Decisions about taxation, land tenure and infrastructure are increasingly made with imperial priorities in mind, not local ones. Religiously, the late Roman world is fermenting. New mystery cults, philosophical movements, and eventually Christianity spread through the cities and even the countryside. At first, Egyptian religion absorbs and hybridizes as usual. Isis and Serapis become global gods, worshipped in port cities from Spain to the Black Sea. You can stand in a temple in Roman Britain dedicated to deities whose roots lie in the Nile Valley. In that sense, Egypt's culture isn't dying, it's leaking out into the wider world. But Christianity is less accommodating to old temple systems. It isn't content to be another god added to the shelf. It challenges the entire sacrificial, statue-filled, polytheistic framework that the temples depend on. By the 4th century CE, Christian emperors start restricting pagan cults across the empire. In Egypt, that translates into temples losing state support, then losing legal status, then slowly losing function. Priests convert or are marginalized, ritual calendars break. Shrine economies dry up. The last known hieroglyphic inscription that we can firmly date is carved in 394 CE at Philae, a Nubian border temple that had managed to hang on at the far edge of the imperial radar. After that, the script that called itself the God's Words falls silent. Nobody wakes up the next morning thinking, our 3,000-year-old civilization has ended. People are still speaking Egyptian, just in its late forms, written now in Greek letters as Coptic. They are still telling stories, still using old place names, still living in the same villages their ancestors did. But the institutional loop that made Egypt Egypt in the pharaonic sense, king, temple, Nile, mart, all feeding back into each other, has finally been broken. Rome wins politically, but the absorption runs both ways. Roman religion, Roman art, Roman notions of kingship all end up carrying Egyptian DNA. Later, when Christianity and Islam wash over the region, they too inherit ideas shaped by centuries of Nile-side thinking about order, justice, and the afterlife. So how long did this civilization last? If you start the clock with the first unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, and you let it run until the temples fall quiet, and the last priest carves the last hieroglyph at Philae, you're looking at something like 2,700 years of recognizable pharaonic culture, followed by another few centuries of half-life under Roman rule. 3 millennia, give or take, of a story flexible enough to survive foreign kings, new languages, and shifting empires. By any reasonable standard, that's astonishing. And yet even this giant eventually melts into something larger. The Roman Mediterranean world, then the Christian and later Islamic worlds, then our modern global culture that still puts pyramids on posters and an all-seeing eye over the back of a dollar bill. The Nile Kingdom didn't just last a long time. It left traces in every civilization that came after. But it wasn't unique in having a long arc on another subcontinent at almost the same time Egypt is building pyramids. Another river-fed experiment in durable civilization is taking shape, one that will vanish more completely from memory, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists digging in the dust. 3. The Indus Valley civilization. While Egypt is etching its name into stone and Sumer is arguing with itself in cuneiform, a third great experiment is unfolding along two rivers you almost never hear about in school, the Indus and the now vanished Saraswati. For a long time, even historians barely remembered it. Ancient Indian texts talk about cities and floods and distant peoples, but they don't give you a neat, labelled map like, "Welcome to the Indus Valley Civilization, founded such and such a year." By the time British engineers start laying railway tracks in the 19th century and digging up suspiciously regular bricks, this civilization has been gone for more than 3,000 years. Those bricks turn out to be a breadcrumb trail. Follow them north and west, and you start hitting ruins with the same strange repeating features. Not just one city, but dozens. Harappa, Mohenjo-Daro, Dholavira, Kalibangan. From the mountains of what is now Afghanistan down to the Arabian Sea, across what's now Pakistan and into western India, an entire urban world starts to emerge. And here's the first weird thing, it's organised. We're used to thinking of the first cities as chaotic mud brick houses tumbling over each other, crooked streets winding around temples, elites plunking down palaces wherever they please. Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro do not look like that. They look planned. You have broad, straight streets running north-south and east-west, laid out on a grid. Side lanes intersect at right angles. Residential blocks fall into tidy rectangles, like someone with a clipboard walked around saying, "No, move that wall 3 feet. It'll throw off the alignment." Underneath those streets, you get something almost no other Bronze Age city can boast, a municipal drainage system. We're talking covered brick drains running along main roads, feeding into larger channels, sometimes with inspection holes and manholes you could pop open to clean out the gunk. Individual houses, ordinary houses, not palaces, often have their own bathrooms or washing areas, sloped floors leading into ceramic or brick-lined drains that plug into that larger network. You have soak pits to filter sludge, settling tanks to catch solids, systems to keep the worst of the waste out of the streets. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, a heavy rain can turn half your neighbourhood into a sewage swamp. In the Indus, somebody has sat down and designed a city that thinks about water not just as a blessing from the gods, but as a logistics problem. Then there's the way they build. The bricks themselves are standardized. Same proportions showing up in site after site, hundreds of kilometers apart. That means someone, somewhere, has decided this is what a proper brick is, and that standard has spread. It's the same quiet, obsessive regularity we saw in Egypt's temple reliefs, but here it's poured into infrastructure. And towering above parts of these cities, you often find a raised fortified mound, sometimes called a citadel, though we don't actually know if it housed rulers, priests, warehouses, or all of the above. At Mohenjo-Daro, on that higher platform, sits one of the most famous features in ancient urbanism, the so-called Great Bath. It's a big, brick-lined pool, carefully waterproofed with bitumen, with steps leading down from multiple sides, and drains for emptying and refilling. You don't build that unless water has taken on some kind of ritual or symbolic weight in your culture. Maybe purification rituals, maybe civic ceremonies. Whatever it was, it mattered enough to carve out prime real estate in the heart of the city. What's striking is what you don't see. You don't get massive dominating palaces like in Mesopotamia. You don't get giant ego-trip tombs like the Egyptian pyramids. You get granaries, storage areas, workshops. You get neighborhoods that look surprisingly uniform in size and amenities. This doesn't prove the society was perfectly equal. Archaeologists argue about that. But it does suggest that if there were kings flaunting their power, they weren't doing it in stone the way their contemporaries did. Instead, the Indus people poured their energy into order. Straight streets, clean water, robust storage, standardized building materials. It's as if the civilization's signature isn't a monument, it's a municipal code. But if the streets and drains give us a sense of how they lived, there's one part of their world that still refuses to talk to us. Scattered across their cities, stamped onto tiny stetite seals, scratched onto pottery, marked on copper tablets and other objects, is a compact, mysterious writing system, the Indus script. Most inscriptions are short, 5 to 10 signs, sometimes a bit more. The symbols repeat in patterns that look tantalizingly like language. Some signs tend to show up at the beginning of sequences, others at the end. Clusters recur across different sites. To the human brain it screams, writing, words, grammar, and then stops. Because right now, we can't read it. There's no Rosetta Stone, no convenient bilingual inscription where someone kindly writes, the king of such and such in the language of the Indus and in Akkadian. Later Indian scripts that we can read don't map cleanly onto these older signs. The civilization itself vanished so thoroughly that even its name is something we gave it, not what they called themselves. Linguists and archaeologists have thrown everything at it. Frequency analysis, comparisons with Dravidian languages, with early Indo-Aryan, with completely different language families. Some argue it encodes a Dravidian tongue. Others think it might be something else entirely, or even a mixed system with both phonetic and ideographic signs. A few skeptics have even suggested it's not full writing at all, but a sophisticated symbol system more like logos or heraldry. The evidence so far leans toward it being a genuine script for a spoken language, but without longer texts and without a bilingual key, every decipherment attempt hits a wall of uncertainty. You can propose readings, you just can't prove them in a way most scholars will accept, which puts us in a strange position. We can walk their streets in our imagination. We can map their drainage lines and measure their bricks. We can pick up the very seals they used in trade, see unicorn-like animals, bulls, strange composite creatures and ritual scenes carved in miniature perfection. But we cannot hear them, their laws, their myths, their arguments, their jokes, their explanations of why the Great Bath matters, who controls the granaries, what the raised mounds are really for. All of that is locked behind a script that for now refuses to yield. And yet, even without their words, the pattern of their cities hints at something deeper about how this civilization worked and how long it managed to keep that complex system humming along. To see that bigger picture, though, to trace how the Indus world rose, flourished, and then thinned out across the subcontinent, we have to zoom out from the neat streets of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro and watch what happens when rivers, climate, and long-distance trade begin to shift under their feet. When we zoom out, the Indus story stops looking like a single city and starts looking like a long, slow negotiation with a changing planet. For a while, the deal is fantastic. From around 2600 BCE, these cities sit in a sweet spot. You've got a vast, seasonally flooded plain fed by glacier-borne rivers coming down from the Himalayas. Monsoon rains arrive on a more or less predictable schedule. Snowmelt swells the channels in spring and summer. Silt spreads out, renewing the soils, If you know how to read the water and time your planting, the land will pay you back every year. The Indus people clearly knew how. You see evidence of intensive agriculture, wheat, barley, pulses, maybe early forms of rice in some regions. You see standardized weights and measures turning up in workshops and trading quarters, signs of grain being collected, stored and moved around in an organized way. You see seals that travel hundreds of kilometers, showing up not just in the heartland but in places like Mesopotamia. To a Sumerian merchant, Meluhar, their name for this distant land meant exotic goods arriving by sea, timber beads, luxury items, maybe cotton textiles. So for centuries the system hums along, cities on the rivers, farming villages feeding them, trade routes tying them into a wider Bronze Age economy stretching from the Persian Gulf to Central Asia. And then the background conditions start to flicker. The simplest way to say it is, the water stopped behaving itself. One big piece of the puzzle is the monsoon. Climate data pulled from lake sediments, cave stalagmites, and ocean cores tells a consistent story. Between about 2200 and 1900 BCE, the Indian summer monsoon gradually weakens. Not one bad year weakens, but century-scale drift. Less rainfall overall, more unpredictability in when it arrives and how intense it is. That might not sound like the end of the world, but if your whole agricultural regime is tuned to a certain pattern of floods and rains, it's like someone quietly retuning the instrument you're trying to play. Fields that used to flood just enough now flood too little or not at all. Wells go brackish, reservoirs don't refill the way they used to. Crop yields become less reliable, and you have to work harder and spread further to keep the same surplus. At the same time, the rivers themselves are changing. Remember that Saraswati the texts talk about? For a long time, it was just a ghost river in mythology. Then satellite imagery and geological surveys started revealing old dry channels, massive fossil riverbeds, snaking across what is now mostly desert in Rajasthan and Haryana. Many researchers now think a huge glacier-fed river once flowed there, drawing water from the Himalayas, may be linked in complex ways to what we now call the Sutlej and the Yamuna. Over thousands of years, those upper tributaries migrated, capturing each other's flow, shifting their courses. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, that great Saraswati-like system seems to have been dwindling, breaking into smaller seasonal streams and in some stretches drying up entirely. This matters because an enormous number of Indus sites sit along those paleo channels. You can almost watch the civilization's centre of gravity move on the map. Early on, big, dense urban sites cluster along these robust river systems. As the channels weaken and abandon their old beds, the cities along them start to thin out. New, smaller settlements appear in regions that rely more on rainfall than on snowmelt, toward the Ganges plains, deeper into peninsular India. It doesn't look like a dramatic fall of Rome moment. There's no burnt layer across the whole region, no clear archaeological signature of mass slaughter or foreign conquest sweeping through the core. Instead, you get something subtler. Cities shrinking, then fragmenting, monumental public works no longer maintained at the same scale, standardized bricks giving way to more local variations, craft industries dispersing into the countryside. From one angle, it looks less like collapse and more like evacuation. People don't just sit in a drying city and wait to die. They follow the water, they push into new ecological niches, places where smaller-scale farming, pastoralism, or mixed livelihoods make more sense than giant, centralized urban hubs. You start to see more wells and tanks in some regions, as if communities are trying to claw back control over increasingly unreliable water supplies. Climate scientists sometimes call this period part of the 4.2 kiloyear event, a wider episode of aridification and instability that rattles civilizations from Egypt to Mesopotamia around 2200 BCE. The Indus world seems to be caught in that same global crossfire, but with local twists, because its lifelines are monsoon-fed and glacier-fed rivers rather than just one Nile. Is climate the whole story? Probably not. We have hints that long-distance trade with Mesopotamia declines around the same period. If fewer ships are making the journey across the Arabian Sea, that's less demand for Indus luxury goods, fewer foreign imports coming back, less reason to maintain big port facilities and specialised craft workshops. An urban economy that once floated partly on international exchange starts losing one of its pillars at the exact moment its agricultural base is getting shakier. Add all that together and you get a picture of cascading stresses: weaker monsoons, shifting rivers, strained harvests, fraying trade networks. Not an apocalypse falling out of a clear blue sky, but a slow grind where each decade asks a little more of the system until the old way of doing things simply can't hold. And yet, when you look closely at the layers, what stands out isn't just fragility, it's adaptability. Because as the big showpiece cities start to fade, the people who built them don't vanish from the map. They pivot, they scatter, they reappear in new forms and new places, carrying with them pieces of the old urban toolkit into a very different world. And this is where the story turns from how did they fall to why is it so hard to even tell what happened. With Rome you can drown in texts. With Egypt you have hieroglyphic king lists, bragging on stone. With the Indus you hit silence, not because they couldn't write. They almost certainly could. Those tiny seals, the short inscriptions on pottery, the markings on tools, there's a system there. Signs that repeat. Sequences that look like names, titles, or commodities. It walks like writing, quacks like writing, behaves statistically like writing. We just can't read it. We don't have a bilingual Rosetta Stone. We don't have long text with obvious structure. No royal annals, no religious hymns, no tax records with numbers you can latch onto. Most inscriptions are 5, 6, maybe 10 characters long. That's enough to know there's a pattern, not enough to break the code. So when the big cities thin out and the brick standards loosen and the long-distance trade dries up, nobody is there on a clay tablet saying, Year X of the Great Drought, grain rationed, people moving east. There's no royal inscription announcing, because the river has abandoned its course, we, the wise king, must relocate our capital. For the Indus world, the transition from urban fluorescence to post-urban scatter is archaeologically visible but narratively mute. That silence is half the mystery. The other half is that, from the outside, the collapse looks weirdly soft. When you dig in the levels above the mature Indus layers, above the crisp baked brick drains and careful street grids, you don't usually find ash and massacre. You find continuity in some kinds of pottery, familiar house layouts in smaller villages, people still living in the same broad landscapes, just in different arrangements. Some sites show gradual abandonment, others snap off more sharply. Some seem to keep going in altered form for centuries. There's no single cut-off date you can stick on a timeline and say, that's the day the lights went out. So historians and archaeologists have to do something uncomfortable. Piece together a civilizational drama almost entirely from stage props and footprints, without a script. We can see that climate stress ramps up. We can see river courses wandering away from old urban hearts. We can see trade links with Mesopotamia fading. We can see ruralization, more smaller sites, fewer giant ones. But was there also some kind of political crisis? Elites losing legitimacy as they failed to manage water and grain? Were there internal conflicts we simply don't see, because they didn't leave charred walls and mass graves. Did disease ride in along trade routes, compounding everything at the worst possible time? Or did the very strengths of the system, its standardized planning, its reliance on specific river regimes, its tight integration, turn into vulnerabilities when the background conditions shifted? We don't know because every hypothesis runs into the same wall. The material record is patchy, and the people themselves aren't talking. This is why you'll see wildly different takes in the scholarship. One researcher will tell you the Indus cities are a casualty of the 4.2 kiloyear event, a climate story with bricks. Another will emphasize internal reorganization, a deliberate shift away from urbanism toward more flexible local strategies. Another will ask whether we're even allowed to use the word collapse. If the population doesn't vanish, it just stops building monumental sewage systems. Even the end date is fuzzy. If you define the civilization as big, standardized, planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, you're mostly looking at about 2600 to 1900 BCE for the mature phase, with a couple of centuries of lead up and tail off on either side. If you broaden it to communities using Indus-style material culture, you can stretch the story down into the early second millennium. Small sites, hybrid traditions, echoes and afterlives. Some of those echoes might even touch later South Asian culture, drainage obsession, bathing facilities, particular motifs in ornaments, patterns of settlement that favour water harvesting. But the link is circumstantial. Without readable texts, we can't follow a priestly lineage across 1,000 years and say, see? Same ritual, same god, reshaped but continuous. So we're left with a kind of archaeological ghost. For roughly 7 centuries, a civilization runs one of the most sophisticated urban experiments of the Bronze Age. Gridded cities, standardized bricks, large-scale craft production, long-distance trade, all apparently without the overt monuments of kings and conquerors that dominate other ancient landscapes. Then, under the pressure of climate, rivers, and who knows what politics and pathogens, the experiment winds down, not with a bang that leaves bodies in a sacked capital, but with a drawn-out dispersal that smears the ending across centuries and hundreds of kilometres. Did they experience it as a catastrophe? As a liberation from urban hierarchies? As a slow, grinding adjustment their grandchildren barely noticed? We don't know. We may never know. And that's what makes their disappearance one of history's great unsolved problems. It's not just that the Indus cities faded, civilizations fade all the time. It's that they faded in a way that dodges almost every tool we normally use to reconstruct the past. The writing won't talk, the rivers won't sit still. The climate wobbles on centennial scales. The people themselves dissolve from big legible nodes into thousands of small, almost invisible lives. Yet in that very opacity there's a kind of warning and a kind of mirror. They built a world tuned exquisitely to a particular configuration of water, trade, and social organization. It worked until it didn't. When the background settings shifted, the form of civilization changed with it. The people adapted, the system as they had known it did not. We live inside our own version of that bargain right now. The difference is, if our cities ever start to thin out, there won't be a mystery about what happened. We're writing the story down, in painful detail, as we go. The Indus didn't leave us that luxury. They left us something stranger, a set of questions we can't quite answer, anchored by the silent outlines of cities that once hummed along for centuries and then quietly let go. Item 4 on our list takes us to a place where there is no silence problem at all, and yet the origins are still wrapped in myth. Ancient Chinese dynastic civilization. From the legendary Zhou to the very real Zhou, you're looking at almost 1800 years of kings, floods, bronze, war and philosophy. But at the beginning what we have is not a neat starting line. We have a story. The traditional version, written down thousands of years after the fact, goes like this. Before there were dynasties, China was ruled by sage kings. Culture heroes, people with names like Yao and Shun, who supposedly invented agriculture, calendars and moral governance in a vaguely golden age. Then came a man named Yu. Yu is the one who tames the flood. According to the classic texts, the world was drowning. Rivers overflowing, fields underwater, villages swept away. Yu's father tries to stop it by building dams and dikes, blocking the water. He fails. The floods just smash everything. Yu takes a different approach. Instead of trying to wall the river in, he channels it. Digs canals, clears outlets, opens paths to the sea. For years he's described as passing his own house 3 times without going in, too busy engineering to visit his family. The water finally recedes, order returns, the people praise him. And then he does something new. He doesn't just hand power back to some abstract council of elders. He keeps it in the family. He passes it to his son. And with that, according to later historians, the first hereditary dynasty in Chinese history is born, the Zhou. On paper, the Zhou dynasty lasts about 4 centuries, ruling over a realm on the Yellow River Plains, inventing bronze, organizing irrigation, holding ritual. It ends when the last Zhou king becomes tyrannical, drowning in wine, ignoring the people, and is overthrown by a virtuous rebel who founds the next dynasty, the Shang. If that sounds suspiciously like a morality play, you're not alone. For most of Chinese history, the Zhou were treated as fact. They sit at the top of official dynastic lists. Philosophers and historians in the Zhou and Han periods talk about them the way modern people talk about the ancient Greeks, distant but real. Modern archaeology has been less sure. The problem is timing. The early written sources that describe the Jia, texts like the Classic of Documents, were compiled many centuries after they supposedly existed. They mix speeches, myths, and heavily edited ancient records in ways that are hard to disentangle. There's no contemporary inscription that says, I, King so-and-so of Jia, built this. What we do have are layers of Bronze Age settlements in the Yellow River region, especially a culture archaeologists call Erlitou, that seem to fit the right time and place. Palatial buildings, bronze workshops, organised roadways, signs of an early state centred in what later tradition remembers as Jia territory. So are the Jia just the legendary memory of something like Erlitou, a real early dynasty whose stories got polished and moralised over 1,000 years of retelling? Or did Zhou era elites, who needed an older dynasty to make their own "we overthrew tyrants" narrative feel cyclical and inevitable, basically invent Jia as a prequel? A cautionary tale about how bad kings lose heaven's favour and get replaced. Different scholars land in different places. Some argue that the consistency of the later texts and the archaeological pattern line up too neatly to be coincidence. Others point out that kingdoms with palaces don't automatically equal the specific dynasty later writers talk about, especially when those writers have strong ideological reasons to backdate their political theories. So when we say Xie, we might be pointing at 3 overlapping things at once: an actual early state, an evolving body of legend, and a later political theory about how power should rise and fall. Where the borders between those 3 lie is still very much an open question. By the time we hit the Shang, though, the fog clears dramatically. Here we're not guessing from later stories. The Shang talk to us directly from the bottom of their trash pits. The heartland of the Shang world sits further northeast, along the Yellow River, in what is now Henan province. By around 1600 BCE, they have cities with rammed earth walls, royal tombs packed with grave goods, and above all, bronze. Lots and lots of bronze. For the Shang, bronze isn't just a useful metal. It's a way of structuring the universe. They figure out how to run large-scale foundries, mining copper and tin from distant hills, moving them along trade routes, smelting, alloying, casting. Their casting technique is advanced even by Bronze Age standards. Instead of pouring metal into simple open molds, they develop complex piece mold casting. Artisans carve a negative image into clay, fit the pieces around a core, pour the bronze, then break the mold to release a single intricate vessel. The results are spectacular, heavy ritual cauldrons with flaring rims, wine containers bristling with stylized animal faces, surfaces so dense with pattern they almost hum, swirling spirals, dagger-curved eyebrows, staring eyes. These are not casual household items, they're power made visible. Bronze weapons, dagger axes, spearheads, arrow points, arm Shang elites and their retainers. Bronze bells and drums mark ritual time, but the most important bronzes are vessels used in ceremonies that connect the living king to his dead ancestors. And this is where the Shang do something that lets us hear their voices across 3,500 years. They write, obsessively, about questions. To communicate with the spirits, Shang diviners take the shoulder blades of oxen or the plastrons, the belly plates of turtles. They smooth them, drill small hollows, and heat them with the hot rod. The heat makes the bone crack. The pattern of those cracks is interpreted as the answer from the ancestors or higher powers. Before or after the heating, scribes carve brief inscriptions around the cracks. Things like, on day X we crack to determine, will it rain tomorrow? Will the king's hunt be successful? Should we attack the Fang people? Will the child of the queen be a boy? Sometimes they add a note about what actually happened, or tally how many crackings were done. Over time, these bones build up into archives tossed into pits around the royal centre. Those carved questions and notes are the earliest fully secure form of Chinese writing we have. They show a script that's already mature, hundreds of distinct signs, many of them recognizable ancestors of modern Chinese characters. Some are pictographic, a sun, a mouth, a hand. Others are more abstract, combining sound and meaning in ways that show long development behind them. So by the late Shang, we're not in the realm of vague legend. We're in a society that keeps records of divinations, names multiple kings, mentions battles, harvests, eclipses. The kings list their ancestors back through generations, matching surprisingly well with the lineage later historians record from much later texts. If the Jasa story is like trying to reconstruct a civilization from half-remembered bedtime tales, the Shang are like finding the diary and the accounting ledger buried in the backyard. And it's from this very concrete, very talkative Bronze Age kingdom that the next big step in Chinese political thought will emerge. When a new dynasty steps in and tries to explain why the Shang fell at all, the last Shang king, according to later accounts, is everything you don't want in a ruler. He's cruel, drunk on luxury, obsessed with a favourite consort, building palaces and pleasure towers while the people suffer. In one famous story, he invents a wine pool, large enough to sail boats in, with trees hung with roasted meat like a permanent buffet. Officials who criticize him are executed in inventive ways. The message is clear. This is not just political failure. This is moral rot. And once again, a virtuous rebel appears. His name is King Wu of Zhou, backed by a line of ancestors who have been carefully cultivating a reputation for wisdom and restraint out on the western frontier. From the Shang oracle bones, we know Zhou starts out as one of the many regional powers the Shang interact with, sometimes as allies, sometimes as vassals, sometimes as enemies. They send tribute. They appear in divinations. They're on the Shang map. Over generations, though, the Zhou clan consolidates. Their homeland sits to the west of the Shang core in what is now Shaanxi. It's a liminal zone, partly within the Shang ritual and tribute system, but also closer to the barbarian peoples beyond. That position gives Zhou leaders a kind of double vision. They can see how the Shang system works from the inside, and they can also see its limits. When a combination of omens, military alliances, and Shang missteps line up, the Zhou strike. Around 1046 BCE, in the traditional chronology, King Wu leads a coalition of armies eastward. Later narratives turn the decisive clash at Mui into a drama of cosmic justice. Shang troops supposedly flip sides mid-battle, disgusted with their king, and the Shang capital falls. The last Shang ruler dies in fire. The Zhou proclaim a new dynasty. On one level, this is the same story pattern we saw with Jia and Shang: weak, immoral last ruler, righteous conqueror, fresh start. But the Zhou do something new with it. They give that pattern a name, a structure, a philosophy, the mandate of heaven. In the Zhou telling, there is a force above even the most powerful king. Not a personal god sitting on a throne of clouds, and not quite the many particular ancestors the Shang obsess over, but something larger and more abstract. Tian, often translated as heaven. Heaven, the Zhou claim, cares about how rulers behave. It is not hereditary birth alone that makes someone fit to govern. It is virtue, a package of qualities that includes justice, restraint, concern for the people, respect for ritual. A ruling house that governs well harmonizes the realm. Harvests are good, borders are secure, floods and droughts are manageable, social order holds. This is evidence that heaven approves, that the dynasty holds the mandate. But heaven is not loyal forever. If a dynasty becomes corrupt, ignores the suffering of the populace, abuses its power, indulges in cruelty, then the harmony of the world starts to fray. Crops fail, bandits multiply, earthquakes, eclipses, and other ominous events pile up. These are not just random misfortunes. In Zhou ideology, they are warning shots. And if the warnings are ignored, heaven revokes its permission to rule. The mandate of heaven passes to someone else. Rebellion becomes not only understandable but cosmic justice. Successful revolution is, in hindsight, proof that the mandate had already shifted. This is an extraordinarily useful idea if you're a brand new dynasty that just overthrew a long-established one. The Zhou can now say, we didn't just win because we had more spears. We won because heaven itself was disgusted with Shang misrule and chose us instead. They redefine the Shang not simply as enemies, but as necessary predecessors in a moral cycle. We're not random usurpers, the Zhou message goes. We are heaven's corrective. What's striking is that this doctrine is flexible enough to justify both obedience and rebellion depending on when you invoke it. In the present, it's an argument for loyalty. The Zhou currently hold the mandate, so resisting them is resisting heaven. In the future, it's also a built-in explanation for their own possible downfall. If someday we become like those last Shang kings, heaven will dump us too. And this isn't just armchair philosophy, it's woven into how the early Zhou present themselves and reorganize their massive new realm. After their victory, the Zhou don't try to rule everything directly from a single center. They move their own capital near the old Shang heartland, but then parcel out territories to relatives and trusted allies as regional lords. These lords owe ritual obedience and military support to the Zhou king. In return they rule locally, performing sacrifices, collecting taxes, managing fields. Over this feudal-looking patchwork, the king stands as the son of heaven. He's not a god, but he is the unique human who mediates between heaven and the realm. When he performs the great seasonal rituals correctly, when he listens to remonstrance, When he appoints the right ministers, heaven's favour continues to flow down the hierarchy. When he fails, cracks appear. Court speeches and inscriptions from the early Zhou hammer this home. Bronze vessels from the period carry texts where a high official boasts, in essence, the king, receiving the mandate, has commanded me to assist him in governing rightly. I must be reverent and not slack, so that I do not lose heaven's favour. It's political theology cast in metal. Over the centuries, this idea of the mandate will become so deeply embedded that pretty much every later Chinese dynasty, even ones founded by non-Han conquerors, will borrow its language. But in the beginning, under the Zhou, it's still a live experiment. How do you run a realm that claims cosmic moral legitimacy when you're also dealing with very human nobles who want more land, more power, more autonomy? The tension between that lofty ideal and the messy reality of Zhou politics is going to shape what comes next, especially once the dynasty's long reign starts to stretch, fragment, and slowly come apart. At first, the early Western Zhou order looks stable. Kings like Cheng and Kang are remembered as paragons. They listen to ministers. They perform the great rituals. They keep the nobles in line just enough without breaking them. But baked into the system is a problem. Every time the Zhou king grants a fief to a relative or ally, that lord starts building his own little mini-dynasty. He marries, has sons, distributes land to them, forges his own alliances and rivalries. Generations pass, the memory that we owe everything to the Zhou king fades a bit. The memory that this land belongs to our clan and our ancestors gets stronger. Meanwhile, the Zhou royal house is doing exactly the same thing. More princes, more branches of the family, more people who expect land and titles. But there's only so much land you can hand out before the map turns into a jigsaw puzzle. By the time you get to the Midwestern Zhou period, the realm is already full of semi-independent states. They still nominally acknowledge the Zhou king, attend his rituals, send troops when he announces a campaign. But they're also forging their own networks, making side deals, feuding with their neighbours. The mandate of heaven gives the whole structure a moral language. It does not by itself tell you what to do when your cousin in the next fief overseas one of your border villages. As the centuries roll on, you start to see a pattern that will repeat over and over in later Chinese history. Early on you have consolidation, a founding ruler with strong charisma, a small circle of trusted allies, relatively clear lines of authority. Then, as the dynasty ages, power spreads outward and downward. Imperial kin multiply, local elites dig in, court factions form, regional strongmen become indispensable and dangerous. For the Zhou, this slow drift from unity to fragmentation has a very literal breaking point. In 771 BCE, enemies from the west, later labelled as barbarians, though they're also entangled with Zhou nobles, attack the royal capital. The Zhou king is killed. Loyalists manage to rescue a prince and move the court east to a new capital in Luoyang. This is the famous shift from the Western Zhou to the Eastern Zhou. On paper, the dynasty continues. The mandate, the rituals, the titles, the idea that there is a son of heaven at the apex of the system all survive. But the reality on the ground has changed radically. The Eastern Zhou kings are, for the most part, weak. They control only a small core territory. The great regional lords, states like Qin, Jin, Chu, Qi, are now the real powers. They still use Zhou ritual vocabulary. They still accept patents of nobility from the king. But when they go to war with each other, they are not asking the king's permission. This long Eastern Zhou era, which historians divide into the spring and autumn period and the warring states period, is chaos with rules. On one hand, violence spikes. Alliances form and shatter. States gobble each other up. Diplomatic conferences turn into assassination opportunities. If you lived as a peasant on some contested frontier, it probably didn't feel like a golden age. On the other hand, this very instability forces new ways of thinking. If heaven's mandate really rests on virtue, how do you build a state that can survive in this brutal competitive environment without betraying that virtue? Or does survival itself prove that you are virtuous? It's in this crucible that the major Chinese philosophical traditions emerge. Confucius is looking back, in the late spring and autumn period, at the early Zhou as a kind of lost golden age. In his telling, the founders balanced ritual, hierarchy, and humane concern. Later rulers, he thinks, have forgotten the proper way between ruler and subject, parent and child, elder and younger. His solution to Zhou-style breakdown is not revolution, it's moral restoration. Teach rulers to rule like the early Zhou kings were supposed to. Recreate that harmony at a deeper, more conscious level. Other thinkers look at the same dynastic mess and draw very different lessons. Legalist philosophers argue that the old feudal bonds and vague moral expectations are exactly the problem. If heaven rewards order, then the way to hold the mandate is to centralize mercilessly, clear laws, harsh punishments, standardized administration, no more semi-independent nobles carving up the realm. In their eyes, the early Zhou were too soft on their lords, and the price was fragmentation. Taoist texts, compiling around the same turbulent centuries, often sound like they've given up on court politics entirely. If every house that claims the mandate eventually decays, maybe the wise course is to withdraw, to seek a simpler, more natural way of life outside the churn of dynastic ambition. Different diagnoses, different prescriptions, but they are all responding to the same underlying pattern that the Zhou experience made visible. Rise, flourish, decay, fall. Unity, fragmentation, reunification. Heaven grants, heaven withdraws. And here's the key thing, later dynasties take that pattern as normal. When the Qin finally unify the warring states in 221 BCE, they don't present themselves as inventing something totally new. They present themselves as the ones who have finally restored order to a realm that had let the mandate fray. The Han, after toppling the short-lived Qin, do the same. So do the Tang, the Song, the Ming, the Qing. Over and over, conquerors explain their rise in Zhou-style language. The old house lost virtue, disasters proved heaven's displeasure, rebels rose, we succeeded. Therefore heaven has chosen us. Even foreign rulers who seize China, like the Mongol Yuan or the Manchu Qing, very quickly learn to speak this idiom. They perform sacrifices at the old Zhou-style ritual sites. They commission histories that paint the previous dynasty's last rulers as corrupt, and themselves as reluctant but righteous saviours. By then the cycle has become almost self-aware. Court historians slot events into a template already 1,000 years old. Philosophers argue about how to prolong the high phase and delay the decline. Popular storytellers spin tales of wicked last emperors and brilliant founding generals. Everyone knows, at least in theory, how the story is supposed to go. That story pattern, the mandate, the moralized rise and fall of dynasties, starts here, in the long arc from Xia legend through Shang oracle bones to Zhou conquest and collapse. If you zoom out, what you see in early China is not just one kingdom living and dying. You see a civilization discovering, and then internalizing, the idea that political power is cyclical, that legitimacy depends on behavior, that collapse is not the end of the world, but part of a larger rhythm. And that rhythm lasts a very long time, from the semi-mythical Xia, through the historically attested Shang, through the long Zhou and its eastern Zhou fragmentation. You're looking at roughly 1,700 to 1,800 years of continuous cultural development. Writing evolves, capitals move, gods change names, borders expand and contract, but people keep telling the same basic story about why rulers rise and why they fall. When we talk about Chinese civilization today, its sense of historical depth, its expectation that disorder will eventually be followed by new unification, we are still living inside the echo of that first great experiment, which raises an uncomfortable question for us. The seventh civilization in this series. If one of the earliest large-scale civilizations could exist for almost 2 millennia by riding these cycles of unity and fracture, what does that say about ours? Are we really building something fundamentally different? Or are we just writing another chapter in a pattern that started with kings making offerings to heaven 3,000 years ago? 5. Mesoamerican civilization, the Maya. So far, we've been hanging out in the old world, fertile crescents, river valleys, dynasties rising and falling under the watchful eye of heaven. Now we jump across the ocean to a place where nobody has ever heard of Sumer, or the Nile, or the mandate of heaven, and yet, somehow, people independently build something just as complex. If you were born in the Maya world at its height, around say 700 CE, your mental map of reality would look utterly alien to a Zhou courtier or a Roman senator. But if we could swap you into their shoes and let you look around, you'd recognize something important immediately. These people, you'd think, are playing the same game we are. They have cities. They have kings, they have nobles arguing in palaces, priests keeping calendars, farmers feeding everyone, and stone monuments that tell stories about who ruled, who fought whom, and which gods made it all possible. The odd thing is, in some ways, they're keeping score more precisely than anyone else we've seen so far. The heart of the Maya world stretches from the Yucatan Peninsula down through Guatemala and into parts of Honduras and El Salvador. It's not one big empire, it's a patchwork of city-states: Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, dozens more. Some are buried in deep rainforest, others sit on limestone ridges, others overlook lowland swamps. And woven through all of them is an obsession with time. To a Maya astronomer priest, the sky isn't just pretty. It's the operating system of the universe. The movements of the sun, moon, Venus, and the Milky Way are like gears in an enormous invisible machine. If you know how those gears mesh, you can predict eclipses, schedule rituals, choose auspicious days for war, even legitimize a new king. So they watch, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. Priests climb pyramids and mark tiny changes in where Venus rises, how the shadows fall at sunrise, when the moon disappears and reappears. They aren't using telescopes, they're using patience. Over centuries, this turns into one of the most sophisticated calendrical systems on Earth. On one level, daily life runs on a 260-day ritual calendar, the Cholkin, and a 365-day solar calendar, the Harb. Every day has a name in each cycle. Put them together, and you get a repeating 52-year period called the calendar round. Like a cosmic combination lock that clicks through all the possible day name pairings and then starts over. But the classic Maya don't stop there. They invent something else, the long count. Instead of just cycling endlessly, the long count is like a giant odometer that starts ticking on a fixed mythic zero date and then keeps a running tally of days since creation. It's positional, like our way of writing dates, and it lets you pin a historical event to a specific moment deep in cosmic time. This requires two things that are deceptively simple but historically rare: a concept of zero and comfort with very large numbers. Maya scribes have both. They use a vigesimal or base 20 numeral system, probably rooted in counting both fingers and toes. By the classic period, they're writing numbers with dots and bars and a special shell symbol for zero. They put these in vertical columns, each position standing for a higher order of magnitude, like 1s, 20s, 300s and 60s and so on. And they're not just doing this as a mathematical parlour trick. They're embedding it in stone. Walk up to a stela, a tall carved monument in a city like Quiriguá or Copan, and the first thing you see, if you can read it, is usually a giant long count date. On 915 0 Venus end, and so on. Then comes the story, which king seated on the throne that day, which ancestor he's tied to, which wars he fought under which divine patron. This is history, but it's also cosmology. Your dynasty's timeline is literally carved into the framework of the universe. To pull this off, you need teams of people who can add, subtract, project cycles forward and backward, and coordinate multiple calendars at once. You also need the observational accuracy to make those cycles meaningful. Maya table of Venus phases preserved in later codices hit the planet's 584-day synodic period with astonishing precision. Their eclipse tables are good enough to predict when the sky is likely to go dark. No metal instruments, no glass lenses, no writing borrowed from older literate neighbours. Completely homegrown. And while the priest astronomers are tracking the heavens, the architects are trying to anchor those heavens in stone. Maya monumental architecture is not just big pyramids in the jungle. It's an attempt to turn cities into working models of the cosmos. Think of a place like Tikal. At its height, it's a maze of plazas, causeways, courtyards, and towering temple pyramids that break above the forest canopy. The great temples often come in facing pairs, aligned roughly east-west. On certain days of the year, the sun rises along their axis in a way that would have been attention-grabbing. In the northern lowlands, at places like Chichen Itza and Uxmal, buildings seem to encode even more specific alignments, equinoctial sunsets, solstice extremes, the risings and settings of Venus at key times in its cycle. A building like the so-called Caracol at Chichen Itza, with its round tower and slit windows, looks suspiciously like a purpose-built observatory. The engineering behind all this is non-trivial. You're building in a humid, karstic environment with no large rivers like the Nile or Euphrates, to move stone by barge. You don't have draft animals or wheels used for transport. Everything is cut by human hands, hauled by human backs, fitted together by human judgment. Yet some of these temples stand 60, 70 meters high. Palaces stretch across multiple courtyards, with vaulted stone roofs using a corbel technique that lets you span interior spaces without metal beams. Ball courts are engineered for acoustics and drainage. Reservoirs and causeways quietly keep the whole system running, and sprinkled everywhere are inscriptions, on lintels, stairways, altars, stelae, wall panels. They record births, accessions, wars, alliances, ritual bloodletting, dedication of buildings, endings and beginnings of calendar cycles. They tie every stone to a story, every ruler to a date, every local event to the larger machinery of time. For hundreds of years this world thrives. Cities boom, go to war, recover, get eclipsed by rivals, reinvent themselves. Artistic styles shift. Dynasties marry into each other's lineages. The long count marches on, then, over the span of a few centuries, something starts to go wrong. Monument dates cluster, then thin out. Some cities stop erecting stelae entirely. Palaces are abandoned while others keep building. Populations in the southern lowland heartland seem to peak and then drain away. By around 900 CE, many of the great classic Maya cities are overgrown or nearly empty, their last dated monuments silent. This is what historians call the classic Maya collapse. And it raises the same uncomfortable question we've been circling around with every civilization in this series. How does something so elaborate, so deeply rooted in time and stone, come apart? The tricky part is that, Unlike later Roman historians or Chinese court chroniclers, the Maya don't leave us a neat narrative that says, "Here is why our world fell." We have to reconstruct it from pollen grains, broken monuments, truncated king lists, and scattered hints in later texts. Which is why when scholars talk about the collapse, they don't speak with a single voice. They argue. They propose models. They test them against data from lakes, caves, and ruins. Some of those models focus on the sky, the same sky Maya priests watched so carefully. Others zero in on the jungle itself, or on the way Maya politics worked when dozens of proud cities all tried to be the center of the universe at once. To understand how this 1,000-year experiment in timekeeping and stone building unraveled, we have to dive into those competing theories and into the slow, uneven way a civilization can stop being what it used to be long before its people disappear. If you zoom in on the southern lowlands where the classic Maya world hit its peak, one pattern jumps out before any Stela does. Water is everything. This isn't Egypt with a nice predictable Nile flood. Most Maya lowland cities sit on porous limestone. Rain falls, soaks straight into the ground, and disappears. There are no big year-round rivers carving through the landscape to bail you out. If you want to keep tens of thousands of people alive through the dry season, you need storage, reservoirs, tanks, aguadas, carefully managed catchment systems. And for centuries, they're very good at this. But the climate doesn't stay put. When geologists pull cores out of lake beds and stalagmites in caves across the Maya region, they see signals, shifts in oxygen isotopes, changes in sediment that line up suspiciously well with those last monument dates. Between about 750 and 900 CE, the record suggests multiple episodes of prolonged drought. Not just a bad year that everyone grouses about, but decades where rainfall is consistently lower than usual, punctuated by especially brutal dry spells. The timing is ugly. These drought episodes land right when many cities have already crammed as many people as they can into their hinterlands, cleared as much forest as they reasonably can for fields, and locked themselves into political rivalries that make large-scale cooperation, let's say, complicated. Imagine living through that convergence. Your city has been growing for generations. Fields have crept farther from the core. Farmers are walking longer distances to reach milpas carved out of the thinning forest. You've cut trees for fuel, construction, lime plaster. You've terraced slopes to control erosion. But every new family means more pressure on the same finite land. Now the rains start arriving late, or they come in violent bursts and then vanish. The reservoirs don't fill the way they used to. The smaller aguadas dry up early. People notice, priests notice, kings absolutely notice, because they've been advertising themselves for centuries as the ones who know how to keep the cosmic machinery running. And beneath the ritual calm, the math is simple and brutal. More people, less water, thin soils that can be exhausted if you push them too hard. Forests that don't bounce back instantly after you cut them, especially in drier conditions. Archaeologists looking at pollen records around major centres like Tikal see forests shrinking and indicators of maize agriculture shooting up in the centuries before collapse. They also see signs of erosion, more sediment washing into lakes, charcoal from increased burning. It looks like a system approaching its ecological limits just as the climate turns hostile. But here's where it gets messier, because while the sky is drying out and the hillsides are getting tired, the kings are doubling down. Classic Maya politics is not a story of peaceful priest philosophers contemplating the stars. It's a world of rival courts locked in cycles of alliance and betrayal, where war is both a ritual obligation and a very practical tool. Throughout the 600s and 700s, inscriptions are full of star wars, captive-taking raids, dynastic humiliations. Great powers like Tikal and Kalakmul arm wrestle over vassal cities. Smaller centres try to punch above their weight or switch sides at the right moment. Victories get commemorated in stone. So do defeats when new rulers boast about how they subjugated their rivals. War in this context isn't total annihilation of populations the way we sometimes imagine it now. It's about prestige, prisoners, tribute, control over trade routes and farmland. But war still costs. Every time a rival king decides this is the auspicious year to march, more young men are pulled away from fields. More food and water have to be stockpiled for armies instead of households. Defensive walls go up. Resources that might have gone into maintaining reservoirs, terraces and canals get redirected into impressing allies and cowing enemies. Now layer that onto drought and overpopulation. If your fields are already marginal because the best land is taken, and the rains are unreliable, and your city's elite are demanding surplus to fund war and ritual, your margin for error approaches zero. A failed harvest isn't just hungry months. It can be the difference between staying on your land and walking away. Some scholars argue that as conditions worsened, warfare itself changed character. From mostly ritualized, calendar-scheduled conflicts designed to capture elite prisoners, war drifts toward more desperate struggles over basic resources and political survival. Fortifications around some late classic sites get more substantial. There's evidence of violent destruction layers in certain cities. It's hard to say exactly how widespread this was, but clearly the atmosphere was not getting calmer. From the vantage point of a royal court, the temptation would be to blame external enemies or improper ritual. If the gods are withholding rain, you respond with bigger ceremonies, more elaborate bloodletting, grander monuments proclaiming your right to rule. You might push your farmers even harder to support those displays, because what other lever do you really have? From the vantage point of a farmer on the edge of your city's territory, the calculus might look different. If another polity a few days' walk away seems to be faring better, more reliable water, less intrusive demands from their nobles, it suddenly becomes thinkable to move. If the reservoir that used to see you through the dry months now cracks and stinks, and your kids are sick, and soldiers from some distant king keep tromping through your fields, the ancient promise carved on the stelae that this place is the eternal heart of the world starts to ring hollow. Collapse in this sense doesn't require cities to be burned from the map in one apocalyptic showdown. It can look like thousands of individual decisions over multiple generations to leave, to trickle away from overstressed centres toward the coasts, the highlands, areas where water is more reliable or political burdens lighter. In the archaeological record, that looks like what we actually see. Great plazas falling quiet while smaller, more dispersed communities elsewhere grow. Monument building stops not because the Maya forget how to carve stone, but because there aren't enough people or enough surplus or enough belief left in the old order to justify hauling another 20-ton block into place. But even in the depths of the droughts, not every city fails at the same time, or in the same way. Some hold on longer, some reinvent themselves, some shift their focus northward, toward regions where water, trade and power are being reconfigured into something new, to see how that transition plays out, and how a collapse can be both an ending and a redirection. We have to follow the people who don't abandon being Maya at all. They just stop playing the old version of the game. So what happens if you walk off stage but you don't actually leave the theatre? That's basically the story of the Maya after the so-called collapse, because while those jungle cities are going quiet in the southern lowlands between about 800 and 900 CE, the Maya themselves keep going. Languages keep evolving, corn keeps getting planted, calendars keep turning. People keep calling themselves by Mayan names and praying to Maya gods, even as the centres that once choreographed their world lose their grip. You can see this if you look north. As Tikal and its neighbours fade, cities in the drier, rockier Yucatan Peninsula are on the rise. Places like Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and later Mayapan start to pull in population, trade, and prestige. The political map is being redrawn, not erased. The architecture shifts. Instead of the steep, towering jungle pyramids built on swampy terrain, you get broad platforms and columned halls perched on limestone ridges. Ball courts are still there. So are feathered serpent motifs, skull imagery, and sacred cenotes used for offerings. But the feel is different, more open, more integrated with wider Mesoamerican styles. There are clear signs of influence from central Mexico, maybe even direct involvement from groups tied to places like Tula, but under the imported styles, a deep continuity remains. Stelae still inscribe dates in the long count. Rituals still revolve around the 260-day sacred calendar. The gods of rain, maize, and death haven't gone anywhere. They're just wearing some new costumes. By around 1000 CE, Chichen Itza itself begins to fragment, but the story doesn't end there either. Power consolidates around Mayapan, which becomes the centre of a confederation of Maya polities in the post-classic period. The great divine kings of the classic era, claiming descent from gods and anchoring cosmic order, are replaced by more corporate, council-based structures in some regions. It's a political pivot, not civilizational amnesia. Then, in the 1200s and 1300s, Mayapan falls apart as well. Internal conflict, rebellion, maybe outside pressures. The big umbrella breaks. Did everything disintegrate? No. The umbrella just shatters into smaller pieces. By the time Europeans arrive in the early 1500s, the Yucatan is not an empty jungle haunted by ghosts of a lost people. It's a mosaic of still-living Maya states, the Itzá around Lake Petén Itzá in the south, the Quiche and Cachical in the Guatemalan highlands, the Zhou, Kokom, and many others across the peninsula. They're trading, fighting, making alliances, and writing history. Literally writing it. In the highlands, scribes compose texts like the Popol Vuh and the Quiche Annals, mythic histories that blend deep ancestral memory with political storytelling. These works, later copied into the Latin alphabet under colonial rule, preserve creation stories, hero tales, and genealogies that link the living Maya to the builders of those earlier cities. The Popol Vuh's hero twins facing trials in the underworld, the cycles of creation and destruction, the centrality of maize as the substance of human flesh. These aren't museum pieces. They're part of how people in the 15th century understood themselves and their place in the cosmos. You can draw a straight cultural line from those stories back to the classic stelae and forward into modern ritual. Even under Spanish conquest, the continuity is stubborn. Conquest is brutal. Epidemics rip through communities that have no immunity to old-world diseases. Forced labour, tribute demands, and missionization reorder daily life. Monasteries are built atop old ceremonial centres. Idols are smashed or buried, codices are burned. But underneath the violence, Maya communities adapt rather than vanish. They translate pieces of their cosmology into Catholic terms. Mountain and cave spirits blur with saints. Old pilgrimage routes quietly persist under new names. Ritual specialists reframe themselves as cofradia leaders, caretakers of saint images who also know when to plant and when to call the rain. Maya languages never go extinct. They branch. Today there are around 30 distinct Maya languages still spoken from Yucatec in the north, to Quiche, Quechua, and Mam in the highlands, to Mopan and Quanjobal and many others. Each has its own dialects, its own oral literature, its own way of talking about time and the sacred. If you walk into a Quiche town in Guatemala or a Tzotzil community in Chiapas, you'll find people whose daily lives are modern in every sense. They use smartphones, they work wage jobs, they navigate national politics, but who also participate in rituals that would make instant sense to a priest standing at a classic period altar. They still track auspicious days using forms of the 260-day calendar. They still make offerings of copal, maize and candles at caves and hilltop shrines. They still tell stories about earlier ages of the world, about floods and fires and transformations, in a narrative rhythm that echoes texts carved in stone more than 1,000 years ago. Even the collapse itself lives on in memory, refracted through myth, cycles of rise and fall, arrogance and punishment, cities that grow too proud and are abandoned to the forest. For the Maya, the idea that worlds can end and be remade isn't a tragic exception. It's the structure of history, and that's the real lesson if we're trying to count civilizations. If you define a civilization as big cities with impressive temples, then yes, classic Maya civilization ends around 900 CE. The skyline changes, the monuments stop. But if you think in terms of people, languages, cosmologies and ways of organizing life, then the Maya aren't an extinct branch on the tree. They're a living, flowering limb that's been pruned, grafted and storm-damaged, but never uprooted. When we look back and say, there were 6 great civilizations before ours, and they all collapsed, we're often really just looking at the parts that left stone silhouettes dramatic enough to impress us. The Maya remind us that what looks like a fall from a distance can feel, on the ground, like adjustment, migration, reinvention, a choice to stop hauling 20-ton blocks for someone else's glory and instead carry your gods and your stories somewhere the wells are deeper and the demands lighter. In that sense, the so-called end of their cities doesn't make the Maya story less impressive. It makes it longer. It stretches from the first farmers hacking milpas out of the forest, through the astronomer kings of Tikal and the merchants of Chichen Itza, straight to kids today laughing in Quiche or Yucatec on their way to school. The jungle swallowed some stone. It did not swallow a civilization. Which raises an uncomfortable question for us, sitting here in civilization number 7, when our monuments crack and our skylines go dark. What, exactly, will still be alive enough to say we're not gone, just changing shape? 6. The Roman Empire. If the Maya are what happens when a civilization bends and somehow doesn't quite break, Rome is what happens when a city refuses to admit that it's just a city. Because Rome doesn't start as a civilization. It starts as some villages on a few hills by a ford in the Tiber River. Mud, brick, timber, farmers, traders, shepherds, bandits. People arguing over grazing rights and water access, not universal empire. And yet, in a few centuries, that little patch of Italy will be telling half the known world what to do, in a language that refuses to die even when the empire that spoke it is gone. Our question is, how long did that thing really last? But before you can measure the empire, you have to watch Rome turn into one. At first, Rome is a monarchy, kings, priests, legendary founders raised by wolves, half myth, half archaeology. By the late 6th century BCE, the kings are out, and the Roman Republic is in. On paper, it looks like a neat system of checks and balances, consuls elected each year, a senate of elders, popular assemblies where citizens vote. In reality, it's a power-sharing deal between a small set of elite families, the patricians, who are very invested in not letting any one of their number become king again. But the thing that makes the Republic dangerous isn't its ideals. It's its habits. Romans fight a lot. And they do it in a very specific way. They lose, adapt, and come back meaner. Early on, they get beat up by neighbouring Latin cities, Etruscans from the north, hill tribes from the Apennines. But every time they lose, they adjust their tactics, reorganise their legions, and then come back with a treaty that quietly locks in an advantage. Instead of just conquering and enslaving everyone, Rome turns defeated enemies into allies, allies who owe troops to Rome, who adopt pieces of Roman law, who slowly get pulled into a web of obligations that always seems to point in one direction, toward the city on the Tiber. That's the first key. Expansion by contract as much as by conquest. By the 3rd century BCE, this experiment in militarized networking has swallowed most of the Italian peninsula. And then Rome picks a fight with somebody big enough that, by all reasonable expectations, should have chewed them up and spit them out: Carthage. The Punic Wars are where Rome stops being a regional bully and becomes something else. This is Hannibal marching elephants over the Alps. This is Roman armies obliterated at battles like Cannae. This is years where, from the outside, it looks like the Republic is done. But Rome does the same thing it's been doing all along, just on a bigger stage. It refuses to stop raising new armies. It takes on debts that should have shattered its economy. It starts building a navy from scratch by copying a ship that washes up on shore, then somehow turns that crash-course fleet into a Mediterranean power. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Carthage is dust. Greek city-states are under Roman protection, and Roman soldiers have marched from Spain to Anatolia. The Mediterranean stops being a patchwork of competing states and starts to look like one big Roman lake. At this point, the Republic is technically still a republic. Consuls, Senate, assemblies, all the old machinery still exists. But the scale has changed so much that the machine doesn't really fit the job anymore. Armies are now spending years away from home, fighting in far-off provinces. Generals are getting rich off loot and land seizures. Ordinary citizens are being squeezed between long military service and farms they can't maintain while they're gone. The gap between the ideal of a city of citizen farmers and the reality of a Mediterranean empire is starting to crack open. Those cracks are where the next phase comes from. Ambitious generals like Marius figure out that if you recruit poor citizens, or even the barely propertied, and promise them land after service, their loyalty shifts. They're no longer just Roman soldiers, they're Marius's men, or later, Caesar's men. Armies become personal power bases. Politics militarizes. The Senate, which had managed to keep any one man from acting like a king for centuries, suddenly has to deal with men who control tens of thousands of armed, battle-hardened veterans who know exactly who got them their farms. You get a century of instability. The Gracchi brothers trying to reform land distribution and getting killed for it, Sulla marching on Rome, civil war, proscriptions, mass confiscations. The Republic is still using its old vocabulary, but the content has changed. Consul now means guy with enough troops to scare everyone else. By the time Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon in 49 BCE with a single legion, it's less a shocking break with tradition than the logical next step in a system where military command and political power have fused. Caesar wins, the Senate submits. Dictator for life. Then knives in the Senate House. Liberty restored briefly. But the Republic has run out of road. What follows is another round of civil wars, until one man, Octavian, soon to be Augustus, learns from everyone's mistakes. Augustus is careful. He empties the reality of the old offices while preserving their shells. He calls himself first citizen, not king. He keeps the Senate, but the real power, control of most of the legions, key provinces, the flow of grain and money, quietly concentrates in his hands. That's where the Republic really ends, not with Caesar's dramatic assassination, but with Augustus's calm, administrative suffocation of any alternative. And yet from the inside, it doesn't necessarily feel like the end. If you're a Roman living under Augustus or his immediate successors, what you notice is that the wars between Romans mostly stop. Trade booms, roads get built, pirates vanish from sea lanes. A temple here, an aqueduct there, a bit of bread and spectacle in the capital. This is the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a couple of centuries, roughly from Augustus through the early 2nd century CE, when the empire hits something like its maximum stable size. Frontiers in Britain, the Rhine and Danube as a kind of living border wall. North Africa pumping grain into the cities. Egypt as the emperor's private treasury. Client kingdoms sprinkled along the edges like buffer foam. From the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Sahara up into the forests of Germania. There's a shared legal framework, shared coinage, shared architectural language. Latin and Greek knit together elites from Spain to Syria. Local gods share space with Jupiter and Mars in hybrid temples. Citizenship, once a fiercely guarded privilege of a small Italian community, gradually expands outward until by the early 3rd century CE, almost every free man in the empire is technically a Roman citizen. From a distance, this looks like the peak of power. Roads, walls, baths, forums, theatres, armies on every frontier, a machine that hums along year after year. But that machine is expensive. Maintaining legions on thousands of kilometres of border eats money. Garrisoning remote provinces, subsidising client kings, paving and repairing roads, maintaining grain doles for massive urban populations, all of it has to be paid for. In the early centuries, conquest feeds the beast. New provinces mean new tax bases, new mines, new streams of slaves. War is profitable. Once the empire hits its natural limits, mountains, deserts, peoples too costly to subdue, that profit model breaks. You're no longer plugging new territory into the system. You're defending what you already have. The frontier becomes a sink, not a faucet. So taxes go up. The currency gets shaved and debased, more silver mixed with base metals. Inflation creeps in. Local elites who used to see service as magistrates and tax collectors as a route to honour start ducking the job because it's ruinous. The state responds with compulsion. You can't opt out. Your city still has to cough up its quota. At the same time, the political system at the top begins to fray. There's no clear, peaceful way to pick a new emperor. In theory, the Senate has a say. In practice, if you control the army closest to Rome, or later any army near a major centre, you can have your troops proclaim you emperor and march on your rival. The 3rd century CE becomes a carousel of short-lived rulers, many of them elevated by their soldiers, and then killed by someone else's. Economists, if they'd been there, would have called it a feedback loop. Instability scares investment, which hurts revenue, which makes emperors lean harder on the military, which makes the military more politically powerful, which increases instability. Meanwhile, the army itself is changing. Increasingly, Rome relies on non-Italian recruits, on frontier peoples brought into service, on federated groups settled along the borders in exchange for military obligations. They're still Roman in the functional sense, but the old idea of a citizen militia from the core is gone. The empire is outsourcing its own defence, while the political centre keeps fighting over who gets to wear the purple. All of this corruption, economic strain, military overreach isn't a sudden catastrophe. It's a set of slow pressures applied year after year, reign after reign, until the structure that looked so permanent under Augustus starts to warp. And as those pressures build, both the rulers and the ruled begin to improvise new ways of staying alive inside a system that no longer works quite the way it was supposed to. One of those improvisations is ideological. For the first few centuries, Rome's identity is basically civic and cultural. You're Roman because of law, language, habit. The gods are flexible. The rituals can be imported. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, as the old machinery creaks, a new kind of identity starts to matter, religious. Christianity, once persecuted, becomes first tolerated, then preferred, then effectively official. For a while, this gives the system a strange new backbone. Instead of loyalty to a city or a dynasty, you get loyalty to a universal church that just happens, conveniently, to be entangled with imperial power. But it also splits things. There are now bishops with their own authority, monks withdrawing from cities, theological disputes that turn into street fights. The empire, which used to absorb gods like it absorbed provinces, now has a faith that sometimes says no. At the same time, geography quietly rearranges the board. The capital shifts eastward. First, it's just practical. Richer provinces in the eastern Mediterranean, closer to key trade routes, less exposed to raids from across the Rhine and Danube. Constantine founds a new Rome on the Bosporus, Constantinople. Over time, more and more of the empire's actual wealth, bureaucratic talent, and military focus tilt in that direction. From Italy's point of view, the centre of gravity is sliding away. The western half still has the Senate, the old prestige, the aura. But it's increasingly running on fumes. Tax bases shrink as estates go semi-autonomous, as local strongmen cut deals with nearby warbands, as plague and war chew through populations. Coins get worse, barter creeps back in, cities, once the beating heart of Roman life, start to hollow out. And along the frontiers, the people Rome used to call barbarians are changing too. These aren't just random raiding parties anymore, they're confederations. Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, groups formed on Rome's doorstep, sometimes inside Roman territory, shaped by decades of trade, treaties and service in Roman armies. Many of them are Christian, though often in slightly different flavours than the imperial church prefers. They speak mixtures of Latin and their own languages. Their leaders wear Roman titles, command Roman-trained troops, and negotiate like Roman politicians. Under pressure from steppe nomads like the Huns pushing from behind, some of these groups stop nibbling at the borders and start looking for somewhere to live inside the empire itself. The Roman response is improvisation again, settling entire peoples as foederati, allies bound by treaty on imperial land. In theory, they defend their assigned regions in exchange for subsidies and a degree of autonomy. In practice, you've just given heavily armed, semi-independent communities prime real estate and a legal foothold in your collapsing system. When the Western government fails to deliver on promises, pay, land, food, those federate forces don't quietly disappear. They bargain harder, or mutiny, or march. In 410, the Visigoths under Alaric, frustrated after years of wrangling with Roman authorities, sack Rome itself. It's a shock, but not yet the end. The empire survives. The court has already been hanging out in safer cities like Ravenna anyway. They spin it as a temporary disaster, but the psychological damage is real. The city that hadn't fallen to a foreign army in 800 years suddenly has foreign troops looting its streets. People start writing books with titles like The City of God to explain how this could even happen in a universe that still makes sense. Over the next decades, more pieces peel off. Vandals carve out a kingdom in North Africa, Rome's old grain basket. Visigoths settle in Spain and southern Gaul. Britain is effectively abandoned, locals told to manage their own defence. Each loss means less tax revenue, fewer recruits, less leverage. What's left in the West by the mid-5th century is a kind of Roman ghost, emperors elevated and deposed by powerful generals, court intrigues in shrinking circles, and administration trying to project an authority it no longer has the means to enforce. Into this vacuum step men, who are technically servants of Rome, but functionally something else. Military strongmen with barbarian troops, Roman titles and their own agendas. They don't need to destroy the empire, they just need to make it irrelevant. By the time you reach the year 476, the stage is set. There's an emperor in Italy, but he's a teenager with almost no real power. There's a Germanic commander who does have power and an army that knows exactly who feeds it and who doesn't. What happens next becomes the textbook fall of the Western Roman Empire, which is a bit anticlimactic on the day it happens. The teenage emperor, Romulus Augustulus, is deposed by Odoacer, the Germanic commander. No apocalyptic firestorm, no final battle at the gates. Odoacer doesn't even bother taking the title emperor. He sends the imperial regalia east to Constantinople and basically says, "We don't need a separate Western emperor anymore. I'll run Italy as your guy." On paper, that's the end. 476 becomes the date school books memorize. But if you're living in Italy that year, the sun still rises. Tax collectors still knock. Bishops still hold councils. The law codes you argue about in court are still the Theodosian and Gregorian collections. You still call yourself Roman, because the real twist is that Rome's empire ends in one place and refuses to die in another. In the East, the Roman Empire keeps going. They never call themselves Byzantines. That's a label later historians slap on. To them, they're simply Romans, Romaioi, whose capital happens to be Constantinople instead of Rome. Over there, the story doesn't look like a straight collapse. It looks like a remix. Latin, the old imperial language, slowly gets edged out by Greek in daily life and administration. Pagans become a small, sometimes persecuted minority. Icons, relics, and saints take up the cultural space once occupied by Jupiter and Mars. The emperor doesn't sacrifice at the Capitoline. He attends liturgy at Hagia Sophia. But if you strip away the religious paint job, you still recognize the machine. There's a professional bureaucracy keeping track of taxes down to the last olive tree. There are standardized laws collected, edited, and reissued. There are imperial roads and postal systems, state workshops and arsenals, censuses and land surveys. There's a gold coin, the solidus, so reliable that merchants in Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia trust it for centuries. That continuity isn't accidental. Eastern emperors consciously pose as guardians of the Roman way, even as that way evolves. Take Justinian in the 6th century. He looks west at the patchwork of Gothic and Vandal kingdoms, sitting on what used to be Roman land, and basically says, "Nope, that's still mine." He launches massive campaigns to reconquer North Africa, Italy, parts of Spain. For a brief, heady moment, the Mediterranean looks Roman again on a map. More important for the long run, Justinian orders a colossal legal cleanup. Centuries of edicts, opinions, local customs, and senatorial decrees have piled up into a legal mess. So he commissions jurists to sort, clarify, and codify it all into what becomes the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. At the time, it's an attempt to tidy up an existing system. In hindsight, it's a transmission device. Because when people in Western Europe a few hundred years later want to rebuild complex legal systems, what do they go digging for in old Italian libraries and church archives? Justinian's Code, Roman law laundered through Constantinople, comes back into fashion in medieval universities and royal courts. Modern civil law traditions in countries like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, plus places they once colonized, trace big chunks of their DNA to that compilation. That's one way Rome doesn't die. It fossilizes in the East, then gets reactivated in the West. Language is another slow-motion survival trick. The spoken Latin of the Western provinces doesn't evaporate when the last emperor goes. It just keeps mutating, region by region, mixed with local tongues and the speech of new elites. Over centuries it crystallizes into the Romance languages. Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and their offshoots. Those aren't just inspired by Latin, they are Latin, changed by time and distance. When you conjugate verbs in Spanish or put adjectives after nouns in French, you're using grammar patterns hammered out in Roman streets and army camps 2,000 years ago. Even the so-called barbarian kings ruling after 476 lean into Roman continuity rather than break with it. Theodoric, the Ostrogoth, who rules Italy in the late 5th and early 6th centuries, lives in Ravenna, surrounded by Roman senators and administrators. His buildings reuse Roman styles. His laws try to balance Gothic customs with Roman legal norms. He's officially a representative of the Eastern Emperor, even while effectively independent. In Gaul, the Frankish king Clovis converts to Catholic Christianity, not the Arian variety many other Germanic elites favour. That aligns him with the Roman Church hierarchy in his territories and gives his dynasty legitimacy in the eyes of the local Gallo-Roman population. Some historians see this as a key move in the eventual fusion of Roman and Germanic into what will become medieval Europe. Meanwhile, in the East, the Roman state keeps absorbing and adapting to new shocks: Persian wars, the rise of Islam, the loss of Egypt and Syria, the pressure of Slavs and steppe peoples in the Balkans. It shrinks, reorganizes its provinces into military districts, called themes, changes its court rituals and dress. But the underlying claim doesn't waver. There is still an emperor. There is still Roman law. There is still a Roman people. Foreigners mostly agree, even if they use different words. Islamic caliphs call the emperor in Constantinople Caesar of the Romans. Western Latin writers call him Emperor of the Greeks when they're annoyed. But they're still arguing about who the true Roman emperor is. You don't fight over a title that means nothing. The religious side of this continuity is just as sticky. The institutional church that grows inside the empire becomes a kind of memory palace for Roman habits. Bishops step into administrative roles once held by imperial officials. Dioceses mirror old provincial boundaries. Church councils argue in ways that feel suspiciously like senatorial debates, just with more theology. When the empire's western provinces can no longer count on imperial armies, they turn to bishops and monasteries for social infrastructure, poor relief, dispute mediation, education. This gives church institutions staying power long after emperors and legions are gone. By the time you reach the medieval period, people have stopped being citizens of Rome in any direct legal sense. But they're still living inside frameworks Rome built: Latin liturgy, Roman-derived law, Roman roads repurposed as pilgrimage routes, Roman city grids beneath their feet. Even beyond Europe and the Mediterranean, Rome lingers as an idea. When Tsarist Russia calls Moscow the Third Rome, it's claiming spiritual descent from Constantinople, which it sees as the Second Rome. When the Holy Roman Empire cobbles itself together in Central Europe, it deliberately borrows the title, however awkward the fit. Renaissance architects in Florence and London and Paris study surviving Roman ruins and try to recreate the proportions. The United States Senate literally meets in a building modelled on a Roman temple front and calls its upper house the Senate. Modern legal systems talk about republics, senates, citizens, civil law, public and private rights, terms that either come straight from Latin or were invented by people consciously reading Roman texts. So if you're trying to measure how long the Roman Empire lasted, you run into a problem. The Western imperial court collapses in the late 5th century. The Eastern Roman state dwindles and finally falls to the Ottomans in 1453. But Roman ways of organizing power, law, space and identity keep echoing forward, reinterpreted again and again. Maybe that's the real pattern across all these civilizations. They flare up, consolidate, overreach and crack, but the end is almost never an on-off switch. It's more like a phase change. Institutions freeze, melt, and get poured into new molds. Sumerian ideas leak into Babylonian lore. Egyptian religious concepts slip into later Mediterranean cults. Indus Valley urban planning whispers through later South Asian cities. Chinese bureaucratic ideals echo from dynasty to dynasty. Maya mathematics and calendars inform later Mesoamerican cultures. And Rome? Rome leaves behind a toolkit so versatile that people are still rummaging around in it today, pulling out words, laws, symbols, and architectural styles whenever they need to make something feel serious, official, imperial. Which brings us back to us. If we're the seventh big civilization in this series, living in a global system stitched together by trade, data, and treaties instead of legions and roads, the question isn't just how long will it last. It's also, when our version finally fractures, what parts of it will stubbornly refuse to die? What will some future culture pick up, centuries from now, and still recognize as ours, the way we still recognize fragments of Rome in the bones of our world? Maybe the answer hides in the way we've been talking about civilizations this whole time. On paper, we gave them neat labels and dates. Sumer, the first cities, and written laws in Mesopotamia. Egypt, 3,000 years of pyramids, pharaohs, and careful negotiations with the Nile. The Indus cities, perfectly gridded streets, advanced sanitation, and a script we still can't read. Early China, dynasties rising and falling, but bureaucracy and philosophy getting sharper every time. The Maya, zero, astronomy, and jungle cities that outlast their kings. Rome, a village on the Tiber that accidentally builds the default setting for Western power. 6 stories, 6 timelines, 6 supposed civilizations. But whenever we tried to pin down when they started or ended, everything got slippery. Sumerian city-states fall, but cuneiform keeps going. Egypt fractures, but the idea of pharaonic kingship and divine order migrates into later kingdoms. Indus cities are abandoned, but their urban logic and trade links echo into Vedic and later South Asian cultures. Chinese dynasties swap out banners, but the exam-taking bureaucrat survives like some kind of administrative cockroach. Maya royal courts collapse in one region, while others are still carving stelae and watching Venus rise. Rome loses its emperors in the West, then keeps haunting law codes, churches, and parliaments for 1,500 years. You can declare them dead only if you ignore all the pieces still walking around, which makes us awkwardly aware of what we are. We like to think of our world as fundamentally new: satellites, smartphones, nuclear weapons, global markets. But structurally, a lot of it feels familiar. A tiny minority sits at the top of complex hierarchies. States coordinate huge territories with shared laws and currencies. Trade moves food and resources across continents. Ideas and diseases hitch rides along the same routes. People argue about what's legitimate, what's sacred, what's rational, in ways that would make sense to a priest in Ur, a scribe in Thebes, a scholar in Chang'an, a senator in Rome. If we are the 7th big iteration, we're not a clean break. We're a remix of everything that came before, running on hardware built by bottleneck survivors 800,000 years ago. So the real question isn't just, how long does Civilization 7 last? It's, what fragments of us will someone else inherit? Will it be our legal concepts? Our digital archives? Our carbon footprint layered into the rocks? Maybe a future civilization will study our ruins and still recognize something uncomfortably familiar. Sprawling cities, intricate inequalities, brilliant problem-solving, and a dangerous tendency to believe the system is permanent right up until it isn't. That's not a prophecy of doom. It's a reminder of agency. Every earlier civilization shaped what came next without knowing it. We're the first that can look back across 5, 6, 7 cycles and see the pattern. We know collapse is rarely total. We know ideas and tools and stories leak through the cracks. That means we get to choose at least a little what we pass on. Do we optimize for short-term burn or long-term usefulness? Do we build institutions and knowledge that might stay legible even if our political arrangements don't? Do we leave behind a toolkit our descendants will be grateful to rummage in, or a mess they'll have to dig themselves out of? That's the kind of question I want this channel to keep wrestling with. Not just what happened, but what does it mean that it happened this way over and over? If you want to keep exploring that with me, across time, across civilizations, hit like so this video actually reaches other curious insomniacs. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing that weird little map of our own tiny global network appear under the video. And if you really want to support this project, the best way is to listen on Spotify. The link's down in the description. Streaming there helps more than you'd think and keeps this whole experiment sustainable. Subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss the next deep dive into how fragile and weirdly durable our species' experiments with civilization really are. Sleep well, think long, and remember, we're not just living in the 7th civilization, we're deciding what the 8th one will remember.